guys, just getting a few admin things done in the background. We'll start in just a minute. There is some material you might be interested in having a look at in the nest before we start. Thanks for your patience and are getting set up for a minute or two there. Thanks very much for joining us. If you're new to the space, we hold these conversations every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern and Thursday evening at 9 p.m. Eastern. We run through the news. A lot of it's from mainstream sources, but we try to accent it heavily using open source information collected from accounts here on Twitter. We also try to present tools and techniques. So whether you're new to open source analysis or you've been at it quite a while, hopefully there's something for everybody to bring up their skills. We also like to have on guests who have been working on their own projects in order that they can promote their work. And hopefully if you hear somebody working on a project that is interesting to you, that might create opportunities for collaboration so that we can build up the community. These conversations rely heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the Spaces window where links to individual tweets are posted. If you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side, you'll see that's the invitation to today's discussion. If you were to click on that, in the thread below, I include all my speaking notes. The purpose of that is so that you don't have to take my word for the things I present. I try to provide sources for almost everything. And it's also a launching point for further reading for material you're interested in. In that way, if you look ahead, you might find issues that lead you to develop comments or questions. If you'd like to join the conversation, hit the request mic button, which is in the bottom left of the Spaces window. We're always happy to have people chime in. And as we go along, if you're enjoying the conversation and you'd like others to hear about it, we'd like as many people in the discussion as possible. Please consider retweeting the space by clicking the button in the bottom right-hand corner of the Spaces window. We have a couple of guests who are going to speak with us today, including Stephen, who is going to chat with us about some themes of Russian disinformation that he, has. It's come to his attention, particularly because he's been translating a lot of Russian language material and has some interest in the region, partly through his work with contributing to War Translated. And then we also have a friend of ours, Fabian, who pays close attention to developments in Africa, given the rapidly developing events in Niger and the ECOWAS ultimatum deadline that fell today. We wanted to do a background on events there. So Fabian's going to chat with us and contribute to our news updates on that front. And then we'll get up to general updates on the war in Ukraine. I will, as usual, start with some resources, but I'll try and go fairly quickly. So if you were, I'm going to start on the far right-hand side of the nest. The first item on the far right-hand side, again, is the invitation to today's space, which if you click through, you can get to the agenda and speaking notes. The second item from the right is our invitation for our next conversation on Thursday, so you can set your reminders now. The third item back has our calendar and podcasts. And so, again, we're just at the beginning of August. It's just being populated. If you click that link, it will open the app up, the Team Up calendar app. It includes several spaces by various hosts here on Twitter, including our friends at Tochny. But in addition, we have some outside events, talks at universities and think tanks. And if they're upcoming, usually it's an invite to the space. If it's a past event, usually there's a recording. And if you have any events you've seen lately that you think would be interesting to the community, please do let either I or my co-host Jacoby know, or if Planet Baroque is with us. She does a lot of the work updating the calendar, and I appreciate the help with that. So you could let her know as well. There have also been a couple of interesting podcasts in the last week, or I suppose just in the last 3 or 4 days since our Thursday conversation. I'm breaking them out to the nest now, and I'll just extremely quickly refer to them. So the first, which should pop up in the nest in just a moment, was a debate that was held just yesterday, I believe. And it was through the organization Open to Debate about whether NATO should admit Ukraine as a member. And it caught my attention because Garry Kasparov, who's an ardent supporter of Ukraine, opponent to the Kremlin, was arguing the position that Ukraine should be admitted to NATO. The second podcast is a video. It was the OSINT session from the Cambridge Disinformation Summit. And this one caught my attention because the chief operating officer of Bellingcat spoke at it. And I haven't often seen their operating officer, so I'm keen, hopefully later today, to check into some of this to hear about how they organize their work a little bit more, get insights into that aspect of their work. There was also an interview with the Lawfare podcast. They spoke with Shashank Joshi, who's the defense editor at The Economist. He just dropped some big articles on the Ukraine war. About a week ago, he released one on what the Ukraine war says about the future of warfare, and that was a whole special issue with about 10 articles. And Shashank just recently put out a very thoughtful article on medical care in the war in Ukraine. And so he spoke with the Lawfare podcast about some of those. There is a new episode of the Russia Contingency that's come out, hosted by Michael Kaufman, distributed by War on the Rocks. Again, that's a subscription option, but it may interest you since Mr. Kaufman's one of the foremost experts on Russian military, strategy and structure. And then finally, our own Exit, who everybody knows has been focused on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and now that initiative is over, is just focused on the ongoing drama in the Black Sea. Because there's so much content there, we may get to some of it in our conversation, but she is holding a standalone space on developments in the Black Sea tomorrow afternoon. And I know that I'll be there, and I think it should be a great conversation. So you can set your reminders now. In terms of some new resources from the last couple of days, I'm putting them up in the nest so they appear to me in reverse order. The first of which is a newsletter on OSINT work. So I like to highlight other people who are doing sort of aggregation of material, and it's put out by Craig Silverman. And he focuses on digital investigation, I think more from the perspective of a journalist, but he highlights a lot of terrific tools in that newsletter. So I wanted to highlight that as a resource. The second item back now should be a tweet from Cyber Detective. Now, this is particular tweet that I picked from her is about interesting analysis of historical maps. You guys may find that interesting all on its own, but the reason I've included it is because about 2 months ago, I had passed along the news Cyber Detective had posted about ending her OSINT work, her highlight of OSINT tools. So I'm happy to report that I saw Cyber Detective in the last week or two had resumed posting OSINT resources, and I DM'd them and said, "Hey, are you planning to continue?" And they came back and said, "Yeah, changed my mind. I'm going to keep doing this work." So if you are not following Cyber Detective, I'd suggest you check that account out and to consider following it, because there are near daily updates of tools. The third item back in terms of resources is a new guide put out by Bellingcat about how to geolocate old photos, for places where the architecture may have completely changed because they're so old, or they, may be regions that aren't well documented. So I'm sure that will help some of you. I know that a family member of mine recently, or like a friend of the family recently, was talking about some old pictures of old churches that they've seen, and said, yeah, I really have no idea where these are located, and they're fairly old. So I might myself have to rely on some of these tips. I'm probably going to try to geolocate them as a fun exercise. Finally, in terms of resources, just because of the wealth of reference material, I've included the thread that Shashank Joshi, again of The Economist, put out just the other day on developments in medical care in connection with the war in Ukraine. And he included many, fascinating papers, research papers and the like, looking at different aspects of medical care. So you guys may enjoy that. Then finally, I'm just going to run through a couple of good examples from the last few days, and then hopefully we'll get to our conversation on some Russian propaganda techniques with Stephen in 5 or 10 minutes. So as for examples, let me break these out into the nest. The first of which relates to the USV attacks in the Black Sea. And without getting too much into that, I wanted to highlight some work done by folks like MT Anderson, and in this case, posted by H.I. Sutton, Covert Shores, about the escorting of these armament ships of the Russians. They're the roll-on, roll-off, or ro-ro ships. And it was one of those ro-ro ships was among the targets in the last few days in the Black Sea. And interestingly, Russia seems to be beefing up defenses. And so H.I. Sutton had noted that even in the Mediterranean, just on the approach to the Black Sea, Russia is now more heavily escorting those ro-ro ships with warships. And it's expected that similarly, they will have heavier escorts in the Black Sea now in an effort to protect them, even though the ro-ro ship that was attacked appeared to have 2 smaller escorts with it at the time of the attack. So I thought that was, the satellite imagery of ships is always interesting, but it's particularly interesting when there are changing tactics. What should be the second item back in the nest is an article from the BBC in the last few days. They're looking at the changing layout of the city of Mariupol. And they use satellite imagery to support their analysis. And I wanted to highlight this kind of work because, a lot of OSINT isn't just for military matters. There's a lot of great work that's being done on humanitarian or civil matters or even environmental issues. And so using satellite imagery to look at the changing structure of the city, and, it's not exactly colonization, but it's essentially displacement of Ukrainians and replacement with Russians. And so I think that's an important issue to keep an eye on. The third example back is a tweet by Jack Margolin. I've highlighted this one because it escaped my radar at the time, and I suspect probably the same for many of you. Interestingly, around the time that the Wagner revolt was ongoing, I think it was actually maybe 2 weeks, even before the Wagner revolt, when Wagner had captured and held for a few days a Russian colonel. Interestingly, at that time, some accounts that seemed to be opposed to Wagner started releasing videos that they had managed to get leaked out that were of the family of Prigozhin, including, I believe, in Dubai. And there was some speculation when the revolt occurred in UK newspapers that there may have been threats made against Prigozhin's family that might have contributed to him ending the revolt. I didn't see a ton of support for that, But now, seeing I had missed this leaking of the family videos, maybe there's a little bit more to that idea. So I wanted to highlight that to you guys as interesting OSINT work that I missed initially. The fourth item back, tweet by Sam Bendet. He's highlighting some work by other folks, but Sam had found a video the Russians put out promoting the sophistication of the factory that they have to construct their Lancet loitering drones. And it was a fairly lengthy video, a couple of minutes long, doing a walkthrough of the factory. And what Sam's now highlighted are some folks who took that video and have edited it in order to overlay information about all the machine tools that are used in that factory, many of which come from Western countries. I'm sure many of them were shipped in prior to the full-scale invasion, but it's still interesting to see what Western tools are relied on by the Russians to manufacture their weapons, as it highlights the importance of ensuring that the current sanctions rules aren't evaded, so that the Russians get access to more of these machine tools. The fifth item back is a follow-up. It's the tweet by Tatarigami, who I believe is a Russian reserve officer. We spoke on Thursday about some work that he did analyzing satellite imagery of training centers in Russia to get a sense of how busy they are. Do they seem to have lots of vehicles for training purposes, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and the like? He's continued that work, looking at some additional training centers. And his conclusion is essentially the same as the thread that we highlighted previously, that Russia still seems to have plenty of vehicles for use at its training centers. So there's no indication of an absolute shortage of vehicles. And in this thread, he also notes that probably many of the pieces of equipment going to the front aren't being stripped from training facilities at the moment, but are still coming from repair centers where equipment that's been in storage for quite a long time is being refreshed and updated. So he has teased that one of his next investigative threads will be looking at satellite imagery of known Russian repair centers. So you might want to look forward to that one. The sixth back, so these last two are just cautions. The sixth item back is a tweet by the Belarusian Hagen Project. And there were a couple of accounts yesterday that came out and said that during that large-scale missile attack on Ukraine, that there were reports that one or more of the missiles had been launched from Belarus. And those claims weren't very specific. I had asked one of them, this is vague. Is this talking about a ground launch, an air launch? Can you give us more details? I didn't get any more details in response to my inquiry, but then I later saw that Belarusian Hagen, who have great sources in Belarus, did a survey, and they called up all the people they know who are watching these sites, and they said they're not aware of any launches from the ground. They do note that there have been many launches from Belarus in the past, more than 700 that they've noted. So they're not opposed to reporting on it, but they just said they find no signs to support those claims. And so this is sort of my weekly reminder that just because you see an account that calls itself OSINT saying something doesn't mean it's true, and that if there's no supporting source, you can't evaluate how accurate it is. And so if it's unsourced, you really have, at least I have a very hard time taking it seriously. And it's always handy to know which accounts are the experts in a given area, like these claims from Belarus. I know to go to the Belarusian Hagen Project. And so it's handy to build up your knowledge base on where to look for the best info. As a final point on resources, it's the seventh item back in the nest. This just goes to new methods of detection. So this is a tweet by Oliver Alexander with regard to an account here on Twitter that claims that it's detecting all sorts of explosions and rocket launches using magnetic anomalies. And pretty well everybody I've heard discuss this have said it's a thing that could actually be useful. It's just that it's unclear, how sensitive it is, how, under what conditions can it actually make detections, and that this one account that's really promoting this method and saying, oh, we detected essentially every major event in the war for the last year. When asked for more details about how it works and sensitivity and so on, essentially doesn't get any meaningful response. And if you continue pushing, then like Oliver Alexander here, you get blocked. And so that once again goes to, if people are making claims, they need to be able to explain it and show their work. And if the response, if they explain it insufficiently, and then the response is to block some of the major accounts who are just asking to understand, it probably means it's not a great source of info. Okay, one last point. I'll just note that friends of ours are, as usual, streaming this conversation to YouTube, and I'm just going to move it up to the front of the nest, but they're streaming this conversation to YouTube, and so if you ever miss one of our discussions and you'd like to catch up, you can always go to the account. The link to it is now at the front of the nest. And I'd encourage you to participate here on Twitter so that you can contribute to the conversation. But we do like to highlight it because sometimes it's more convenient for people to listen in that format. Okay, that's it for the background material. Thanks for hanging with me through that. So we're going to move on to a conversation on Russian propaganda methods, and I'm glad that Stephen's able to join us today. Stephen's spoken with us once before to go through a bit of a profile of the work that he does as a contributor to the War Translated project. But we're happy to have him back, and he has, interest in a bunch of different areas. So I guess I'll just say, Stephen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Michael. So I'll just introduce myself. So I help out with translating Russian language material, and much of it is pro-Russian and propagandist in nature. So
Yeah, so sorry, it looks like we may have just dropped Stephen for a moment. That's not just me, right? Yeah, okay, we'll get Stephen back up in just a minute. To help you get a sense of what we're hoping to work through, I'm going to put some material up in the nest as recent examples of Russian disinformation. Many of them would be very familiar instances to you. So just bear with me one moment while I put that material up. So these examples, include some of the fundamentals like Russian messaging around
I think we've had a little crash there. We appear to be having some issues today. Our apologies, folks. Jacoby, go ahead.
Sure, and just as that crash was happening, I was having a little crash myself, so I apologize. I also, while Michael was putting something up in the nest, I added a little thread of resources that I think Stephen might reference in our conversation today. It's second back, and it's not very many resources, but it's also the top post there is pretty much the questions that we're going to sort of run through with Stephen after we sort of talk a little bit about his background and what it is that he occupies himself with, most often with War Translated and where his interests lie. But it looks like Michael's back, and so I'll go to you.
I am. Thanks, guys, for your patience. I appreciate having both the speaker and then the host drop out in order. It's good for a laugh, but that's kind of how live audio goes on Twitter sometimes. So we're just getting.
I was having issues with my mic. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Steve.
Oh, right.
So thanks for coming back.
So how much did I get into my rant before I was rudely interrupted by Twitter?
I think, unfortunately, I only heard about 10 seconds of rant, so you might just want to start from the top.
I'll start it all over again. Okay, so just to introduce myself, in addition to the introduction Michael gave me, was that I help out with translating Russian language material, and many of it is kind of pro-Russian and sorry, I think I got cut off again. So, as I was saying, I help out with translating Russian language material, and many of it is pro-Russian propagandist in nature. And I also know people in Russia from since before the conflict started, who I still keep in touch with, because I think it's very interesting to talk to people living in that sort of situation. I've also been in the Russian language information space since I was very young, because I have relatives in the region. So this all has given me insight and interest in how Russian propaganda operates, its techniques, and its effects. So the first question Jacoby had on the bulletin, which I suppose I'll get right into, is what do I mean by external and internal Russian propaganda? So I have this concept where I believe that Russian propaganda can be split into these two distinct kind of types. And there's one type, internal propaganda, which is meant towards internal consumption within Russia, and the other is external propaganda, which is meant to be consumed outside of Russia. So usually external propaganda would be targeted towards Western audiences. But lately we've been hearing more and more about it being targeted towards African audiences, and also Russians who are anti-war and living abroad. Now, believe it or not, Russian propaganda still tries to target these people, even though they're anti-war, by kind of introducing subconscious messaging, such as that if Russian propaganda says that everyone in Russia supports the war, and they publish, say, a poll stating that 90% of people support the war, that's also a form of propaganda, because it convinces the anti-war Russians living abroad that they're the fringe and they should just keep to themselves. So the internal version, if I were to describe it more, it tends to be a bit more emotional, preposterous, and targeted towards Russians usually living in the provinces without access to multi-domain sources of information. So they just have their television and nothing else. So a great example of this, and I think Jacoby put it up in the Nest, it's one of the links up in the Nest, should be at least, was alleged car of Ukrainian civilians being stopped by Ukrainian soldiers, and the woman being interrogated as to why she's not speaking Russian. Why she's not speaking Ukrainian, excuse me. And this video really has all the hallmarks of Russian propaganda. So the first thing you notice about the car is that it has the German Balkenkreuz painted on it. So that's the cross that Nazi German vehicles had on it. And right beside that cross is a Ukrainian flag. So this is the first kind of theme of internal Russian propaganda. It's painting everyone else who opposes Russia as fascists and enemies with which there can be no negotiation with. Also, an interesting thing is that the woman has a Muslim name. This is meant to kind of spur sympathy among the large Muslim diaspora in Russia, which I think is very underrepresented in discussions of Russia. They make up a large part of Russian society. And in general, it's a very emotional situation. What happens is basically a woman is stopped at a roadblock by these Ukrainian soldiers, allegedly Ukrainian, and they shout at her to speak Ukrainian instead of Russian. Now, later on, it turned out that the video was faked, and some OSINT journalists actually geolocated it. I think it was done by Geolocated on Twitter. That's an account I highly recommend. They do a lot of war stuff, but they also do a lot of debunking Russian propaganda because it can often be debunked through geolocated footage. And basically, an OSINT investigation found that the thing was filmed behind Russian lines in, I believe it was near Donetsk, but Russian propaganda never retracted it. They never said, "Oh, we apologize, this was a fake video." They instead just had no response for it, but they didn't need a response. Why? Because this was a video designed for internal consumption, and Russians who watch television, they very rarely access the internet. So that's, I believe that's the primary so to speak, feature of internal Russian propaganda. It doesn't need to be very factual because people won't fact check it anyway, but it needs to be emotional. And this video, I believe, is one of the best examples of it because it's very emotional. The messaging in it is very straightforward, but it's not too in your face. So people almost feel like they're coming to the conclusion themselves. So the next part of it is external Russian propaganda. So this is a lot more nuanced and a lot more sophisticated.
So
this
Steve,
is based, yeah.
Just before you launch right into that, I see that Jacoby has put her hand up. And just before going to Jacoby, I will note to the audience that I did put the first item in the nest includes sort of the list of points that we're going to run through with Stephen. And then behind that are many of the items that he's speaking to. So that reference he made to the
Stephen, I just had a quick question about the example that you're highlighting there about the video debunked by some geolocation. And I noticed that that's from about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago from now. And holding that up as an example of the internal propaganda that Russians are being subjected to, and wonder if that, from your perspective, that methodology of putting out propaganda is still very prevalent today, if it's become more pervasive, or it's permeated, other areas than just television, or it's about the same as it was last year, from your perspective, what you see.
Hi guys, sorry. It looks like we're having lots of little technical issues today. It looks like Stephen's just cycling back around. So we'll try and get him connected one more time. I see, Jacoby, your hand is up. Did you want to come in with a point while we get Stephen connected?
Yes, and I apologize if I was going on there. I was just asking Stephen if he could speak to the video that he put up there, is from last year around this time, and whether or not he's seen that this example from last year is as pervasive as it was then, if it's he has said it's representative of a lot of what's out there, but if there are more, the Russians have doubled down on that way of doing propaganda internally, or not. But I see that we've lost him. Oh, there he is, coming back, I think.
Hey, Stephen, are you back with us? Looks like the answer to that is no. While we get that connection done, I see that Jane has joined us. Jane, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm also a victim of the technical glitches today. Yeah, I'm curious to know how Russian, in the sort of non-internet connected, in the less, well, in the group of people that Stephen has outlined here, sort of the TV watching Russian public, has their opinion hardened? I mean, Jacoby said doubled down, and I guess with what's going on with Wagner, I think that Putin's got to thread a very thin needle here. And I'm curious to know what he thinks about if that's just continuing to sort of, bang on as it has been, and how the messaging has changed to the more informed folks. But I realize he's going to talk about that later, so I will let him do so.
Okay, thanks for the question. So, Stephen, when you disconnected, I think you had just heard Jacoby's question. Did you want to respond to that? And then we'll see if we can work in Jane's details as you work through your presentation.
Yeah, sure. So Jacoby's question was, has this kind of evolved since the example that she rightly says was a year ago? It has not evolved in the slightest, which is why I feel comfortable using an example from a year ago. Because if you turn on Russian television, so for example, recently they had an example of allegedly Ukrainians shelling civilians in Donetsk. It's exactly the same style of propaganda. But as to her point of has it kind of moved off of television into other locations, I think the opposite has happened. Before, you would often see these fakes promoted by Telegram channels, Kontakte, which is basically the Russian analog of Facebook. But now, basically, there's no audience for these obvious fakes outside of Russian television. So they've very much gone back to television and have focused it on there. As to the intensity of these fabrications, I would say that they have only escalated, especially over the winter months during the campaign to bomb the energy infrastructure. There were many voices openly calling for to kill more Ukrainians, to kill more, to use more cruise missiles. Why aren't we hitting their cities more? I remember there was even a host, now I forget his name exactly, who, believe it or not, got banned off Russian television for extremist language, if that's even possible. What he did basically was he encouraged Russians to drown and kill Ukrainian children, toddlers, and so on. So now this also kind of comes into the question that was asked while I was gone, which I still heard. Putin will keep escalating this rhetoric. He'll keep making it more radical and more radical. Why? Because angry people are more kind of engaged in the propaganda. They're more likely to tune in. And the angrier they get, the more likely they'll actually be to go sign up and fight his war, which is what he needs. So I have seen propaganda being escalated from when we began this war. They were talking about Ukrainians are our brothers, they're just led by a misguided governments. Then it kind of led into some Ukrainians are fascists, we need to stomp that out. Then it turned into all Ukrainians are fascists. During the winter, it turned into we need to kill all Ukrainians. And now it's just, if you turn on Russian television, you constantly hear messaging about how we need to destroy the West and all of this. So in response to that question, it has stayed on television, but the style remains the same and the escalation only keeps on growing.
Well, I'm sure that Jane appreciates that response. And I know you have a few more examples to work through. So I think that perhaps you were going to start to speak about the aims of Russian propaganda at home versus abroad. So I'll just let you keep going.
Yeah, so first I wanted to cover what external propaganda is. So what we just spoke about there was internal propaganda. So that propaganda is meant for a very much internal Russian audience that only watches television as their only source of news. Now, external, on the other hand, in contrast to this emotional and out of touch with reality style of propaganda, is more sophisticated and targeted towards audiences that are more well off. So it adapts to its target audience very well. It drops a lot of the genocidal rhetoric in favor of more quote unquote common sense rhetoric. So an example of this external propaganda was the constant misinformation targeted towards Western audiences about how much it's costing the American taxpayer to send aid to Ukraine, and how Europe will freeze over winter because of large energy prices. Now, in contrast to internal propaganda, the main point here isn't emotions, it's money. So it's very much targeted towards people for who money is the main kind of worry, not their existence. So it's also used in African countries. If you ever now, I'm not an expert in Russian propaganda in Africa, so I cannot speak to this in any depth whatsoever. But they seem to be very much pushing an anti-colonialist agenda, which would seem very hypocritical to anyone who watches Russian television, because all they speak about there is the need to colonize Ukraine because Russia is the superior country and therefore it has a right to. So there's very much a hypocrisy going on there, but people who consume external propaganda very rarely interact with people who consume internal propaganda. And Telegram channels, even pro-Russian ones, would more so be considered external propaganda because they're targeted towards people who are more or less more rational in their consumption of information. But external Russian propaganda, it presents a more nuanced narrative, a more fact-based narrative, but it still presents a pro-Russian narrative. And that is why they took out Strelkov-Girkin, because he was presenting a pro-Russian narrative, but one that was very much in touch with the facts and the realities of what was going on the ground. And he was kind of taking away a lot of the external, the audience for external Russian propaganda. So, for example, at Word Translated, some of our most successful posts were always hearing what Girkin has to say about the situation. He very much had the same style as external propaganda, except for the one small nuance that he was actually telling the truth. And that's why it was very important for the Russian government to take him out, to not only to take him out personally, but to discourage other Russian bloggers from posting things that may be too realistic. Now, ever since we've seen the arrest of Strelkov, there has been a very much diminishing doom posting, as people like to call it, in the Russian information space. It's presented a lot more nuanced, and less people are willing to do it. So in that way, the arrest of Strelkov-Girkin was not part of a broader political purge, as many people suspected it to be. It was specifically an information warfare operation targeted to mitigate the effects that he was having on the information space.
Which, will make it very interesting to see how or whether they adapt their strategies at all now that Strelkov and some of his associates have been reined in. Do you anticipate that they might have to adapt them because some of those pressure valves, they're shutting them down?
Well, I believe that the situation they have at present is working quite to their advantage. They prefer to preserve more or less the status quo. So I think the pressure valves will stay around at the same level as they are now. I think the arrest of Girkin very much kind of diminish the need to take any other big measures that would be detrimental to the popularity of the government.
And so I know that another point you wanted to talk about was whether this propaganda does work domestically. I've seen a bunch of efforts to try to poll the Russian populace about their attitudes on the war. One of the leading centers on that is the Levada Center, but that there has been lots of criticism as well about even the efficacy of standard polling or statistical techniques given the social repression in Russia. So what do you think? Do you think that the propaganda efforts are working domestically?
Now, first, I'd like to address the point about the polling and state that I am very much in agreement with the people who criticize it, because polling in Russia never has been accurate and probably, as it stands, will not be accurate in the near future, for the simple reason that if people held an opinion that was contrary to the official party line, that is to support Putin, to support Russia, to support all this, they simply wouldn't state it, because there's very much a mentality in post-Soviet states that everything you say or write down or tell someone else is being written down, monitored, and kept on record for later on. So that's the first reason. People won't tell you the truth because they suspect that you're working for the government, especially in political topics, which is why the most common phrase you'll hear when going up to a Russian to ask politics is "Я вне политики," I'm not into politics. But the other reason these polls, I suspect, are very much fabricated. Now, some of these polls are done by opposition organizations or neutral organizations, and those polls would probably be closer to the truth. But the Russian state also possesses leverage over its own polling infrastructure, and they use this to create a false consensus in Russian society. So they paint all these, for example, Putin's approval figure is something like, I believe it's 90%. The reason why they paint this most likely artificial figure, I highly doubt that 90% of Russians actually support Putin, is to create kind of a feeling with people that do not support Putin. These people, for them to become convinced that, oh, everyone else supports Putin, I might as well just hide out and keep my beliefs to myself. So I very much agree with the people who say Russian polling is not to be trusted, and that's for several reasons. As for if the propaganda is working generally, I would say the answer to this is fairly simple. It's yes. Now, it doesn't mean that the propaganda is working uniformly, or like that every Russian is convinced that the war is good and he supports Putin. But it does work on a large, and I would say definitely a majority of the population. It works to different levels and extents. So some people may be thoroughly convinced that Putin is a god emperor and we should go conquer half the world, while most people would probably be more nuanced, but overall it does work. Now, to define what is working and what counts as Russian propaganda working and what counts as them not working, I think first I should discuss the aims of Russian propaganda. So the ultimate objective in most cases is not actually to generate support, but to generate indifference. And this is the case both in the West and among Russians that may be more liberal leaning and live in urban centers. Now, Russian propaganda among these people tries to generate fatigue and burnout, not actual support for the war, because they know if they fatigue people enough with stories about how Russia is winning and how every Russian supports the war, no one will go out and protest. Now in the West, in this theater, they're very much successful, because as we can see, no one is going out to protest Russia, even though possibly they would have had some success if they did. For example, we saw protests at the beginning of the war, quite significant protests, and I doubt that a lot of those people have changed their positions. What I think is that those people are now too scared, and I don't blame them, to come out and protest. Now, the objective of Russian propaganda in the West is far more nuanced. It's more to pollute the information space in general, so people have less trust in general, and they have less trust of both Russian sources and Ukrainian sources. So, for example, I think everyone here has heard of the Russian casualty. Yeah, Jacoby has a question. I think I'll answer that first before I go on.
Oh, thanks, Stephen. I put up in the Nest an article from the Kyiv Independent that speaks a little bit to your point about the aim of the Kremlin's propaganda outside of Russia, that it sort of to your point, parallel to your point, is the idea behind undermining the trust between Ukraine and partners. And the ultimate goal, I think we talked about this quite a bit, is everything is aimed at undermining the support for Ukraine, sowing seeds of doubt, sowing seeds of confusion, sowing seeds, so that it tamps down, as you're saying, confidence. And just this article speaks to it, to exactly what you're saying, if people want a reference point.
And just while we're discussing additional resources, it also mirrors points that Stephen's made. If you were to look at the third item back in the Nest, the tweet from the Russian Media Observation Group, they're a group at a Canadian university, actually near me, who has been trying to quantify the different topics that Russia highlights across time on their evening news. And so they've been at this consistently for, I think, more than a year now. And they've come to the conclusion that it seems like most of the narratives that Russia had been using have dropped away. And there are only a handful that they have, but that it doesn't seem like there's actual correlation between what narratives are pushed on Russian domestic news and what events are happening in the world. It just seems like they're using one theme, and then as that seems to have reached its effectiveness, it's saturated the population, they'll move to another theme, and they have only 3 or 4, and they just seem at this point to almost be rotating them without regard to the actual events on the ground. So if you want to see quantification of some of the things Stephen's speaking to, keep an eye on that Russian Media Observation Group. But Stephen, back to you to talk about, I guess, what the average Russian actually thinks about the war.
Another source I'd very much like to recommend is Julia Davis. She actually watches Russian propaganda consistently. Now, it's not particularly an activity I like to engage in because it's not very enjoyable, but she actually posts a lot of the takeaways from Russian propaganda every day. So if it translated Russian propaganda, so if you want to know what they're talking about, what's going on, you should follow her, and she really does do great work. But anyway, as I was saying about degrading the information space overall, now Russians, ever since the start of the war, have published casualty figures that often seem ludicrous. They claim to have destroyed, I think it's twice as many HIMARS as Ukraine has received in total. Now, I believe that the reason for this claim that can be so easily factually checked is that they want to create the feeling among people that Russia is lying about its casualty claims. And since Russia is lying about its casualty claims, surely the Ukrainian government casualty claims that are published in much the same format are also lies. So this is a great example of how Russia uses the both sides narrative, or the whataboutism narrative. And in this, I feel that they have been very much successful, as the average person, now not Ukraine supporters, I would say the average person, as the war has gone on and on, even in the West, they have started to differentiate between Russian and Ukrainian information operations less. That people no longer trust Ukrainian media outlets as much as they did at the start of the war. And in this sense, I would make a point that Russian propaganda is very much similar to Russian artillery in that it's inaccurate, it expends a lot of resources, it takes ages to get anything done, but eventually it simply saturates the enemy and leaves them with no alternative as to kind of get too fatigued to resist. So I would say that Russian propaganda in the West is kind of successful in deteriorating the information space, and many people in the, so to say, in the neutral, many people have gone into the neutral space over this conflict. You don't see as much active verbalized support for Ukraine because people are simply apathetic, and that is the objective that Russia is pursuing in the West, and it's very much successful. As for the objective Russia is pursuing in itself to promote the conflicts among its citizens as a rightful undertaking, I think they are also very much successful in this undertaking. And well, what do I base my claims on is the conversations I have had with Russians who are living in Russia. So I've had conversations with several Russians, and they have a variety of political beliefs. So for the sake of simplicity, I'll talk about three Russians who I've talked with. So one of them is a very much liberal-leaning Russian who, upon the news of mobilization, he fled to Armenia, and he's been living there ever since to avoid being sent to the front. The other is someone who works in the Moscow police department, and he was actually conscripted kind of to fight Wagner. He was given an assault rifle and told to hold out in this trench, but that's a story for another day. And he's a very much pro-war leaning person. And the third person, and this is who I believe represents Russian society the best, is a person in his late 30s, a college professor, who holds what seems to be on the surface neutral position. But once you actually get in and question him, it becomes very clear that at his base, he does support the war subconsciously, if not consciously. And if there was to be another mobilization, he would not resist before being sent to the front, which is ultimately the objective of Russia. It's not to create conscious support for the war where they're all going out on the streets and yelling forward and Ukraine are all Nazis. It's to suppress the person to a state of kind of indifference. Now, I asked him the question, if there was to be a mobilization, would you go? And he answered me in a very interesting way, and I think it's a very, very much archetypal of what many Russians feel, is that, and I'm quoting him here, is that I would have no choice but to go. These events just happen, and we, the folk, Russian word narod, must simply live through it. And this is the apathetic feeling, the zeitgeist, which I believe has taken over Russia, that we are the folk and we must simply obey what we are told. These people won't go and volunteer to go join the war. But if there is to be another mobilization, if the Russian army will need to afford it, or hypothetically, if Russia loses the war and Putin orders everyone to stay home and not protest, these people will obey. So in conclusion, to wrap up this point, I believe that yes, Russian propaganda has been successful in accomplishing its objectives at home and abroad. And I believe that the West should take Russian propaganda more seriously, because I believe we have very much a tendency to laugh it off as all these schizophrenic Russians pushing these stupid messages. But no matter how stupid the messages are, they're still working in Russia, most certainly, and we need to be very careful in so far as that they won't work in the West.
Jacoby, go ahead.
So, Stephen, when you say that these techniques are effective, and particularly in the West, do you, from how you see people respond to them domestically and outside Russia, see ways that the West can easily respond to them, bat them away in a way that is not being employed or underemployed by the West that sticks out to you?
Well, I think there's no silver bullet for this, but the main way to combat this is just to post more fact checking, which the West is generally doing, but it's not doing enough. It's not doing enough to counter the messages. But then again, there is no real way to win an information war. The paradox of it is, if the West starts fighting it too hard, so for example, in Europe, they banned the Russian propaganda website, Russia Today. Russia can just use that as another talking point, as we're being censored. So now you see that the West is just a bunch of hypocrites. So fighting an information war is very, very difficult. And this is a topic that is discussed by Ukrainian British author Peter Pomerantsev in his book on propaganda techniques. Now, I'm not sure if Jacoby put that up in the nest, but the title of the book is now I forget the title because I read it quite a while ago. Maybe Jacoby can come in on this in a second. But basically, the book describes all these information warfare techniques and how we can best combat them. So I'll give it over to Jacoby in case she has something to say on that.
I did just put up in the nest something from Peter's timeline on the book. It's called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. It's a very good read, and he has a more recent book that's come out that I haven't had a chance to take a look at and see if it's an updated look at a lot of what he talks about in this book. But based on the first book, I imagine it would be just as good. But my comment to what you were saying, Stephen, is that, I've seen it seems that it's sometimes effective when Ukraine or Western sources come out and preemptively say, expect Russia to do X, Y, and Z because, certain things are lining up and this is likely to happen, or a false flag event is likely to occur here. Or, when you basically, in a legal context, people do this in a court of law where, if there's information that could be used against your argument, you say it first and you contextualize it and put it out there, because in that way you can sort of control a little bit how it's understood, how it's contextualized, and that is sort of it seems to me one of the more effective ways if we can anticipate certain things. But that's a very difficult thing to do, and it's also can be perceived as very self-serving at the same time. I wonder what you think of that technique.
Well, I certainly agree. It's one of the best techniques to use, and when done properly can be very effective. But as you pointed out yourself, it can be very difficult to kind of preempt these messages, especially considering that Russian messaging is it can be quite unpredictable at times. And what Russia has developed in its information warfare campaign is the ability to discredit the West generally. So they've been very much pushing this agenda through multiple of their sources in the West, that everything the Western media says is lies. So I think we need to start off on that. We need to increase Western media credibility overall, but preempting is a great technique. Now, as for how we can increase Western media credibility, it's already high, but we need to refrain from being sensationalist. And I think that is why people on Twitter who publish all these sensationalist takes, that's why they're so damaging, is because if we hype up something too much and then it turns out to be false, that decreases overall credibility of pro-Ukrainian sources and the media. And if we decrease credibility, Russia has an easier time of discrediting our messaging, even if it is preemptive. And as you said, preemptive messaging is one of the most effective forms of messaging. So I think a lot of, like, for example, there was a lot of hype on Twitter and in the Western media before the Ukrainian offensive, which I believe hyped it up to be far too much. And that has given Russia some of its best information messaging, I would say, in months, where they said, look at what the Western media was telling you and look at this now. So I think combating Russian propaganda is very much a long-term process. It can't be won like a battle. It needs to be a consistent long-term process of credible effectors, and making sure to not give into sensationalist messaging is one of the most crucial points in that long-term uphill struggle, I think.
You also made the point earlier about, you differentiated between the consumers of this propaganda in Russia versus the consumers or targets, depending on your perspective, of this propaganda outside of Russia, and that perhaps the audience inside Russia is perhaps less media savvy, less they have less access to outside news sources and the like, or even just the internet itself, or social media, or other types of media, versus outside the country, where people the perception is that people are more savvy, more in touch with various news sources, so perhaps have a false sense of understanding or security in their own ability to receive information and analyze it. It strikes me that I see this a lot on social media, and this is purely anecdotal in the moment, but also having read a lot of things about this, that people it strikes me many people tend to take in information that they're seeing as though they can handle it, that they are intellectually capable of analyzing it, and they miss the intent that you're talking about, the targeting that you're talking about, that appears to be very clearly laid out in the techniques that Russia employs.
Yeah, so there's very much that difference in target audiences that you mentioned very much plays into what techniques Russians use on both of these target audiences. As you said, for the people in the West who may consume from high quality sources, they are a lot more vulnerable to what is called the fire hose of falsehood, which is basically when you spray so much information, so many fakes, that they reach the target audience before someone has a chance to debunk them. And therefore, even people who have access to debunking sources, so even if they're saying that in the pro-Ukrainian information sphere, and they follow people who debunk this information, if Russia releases so many theories that these people can't catch up with them, there might be a chance, and there often is a chance, that one of those theories slip through. Now, this is something we saw very much with MH17 shooting down. Now, for those of you who are unaware, the MH17 was a jet aircraft full of passengers that was shot down over the Donbass region back in 2014. And the Russians did it. And this was proven by a Bellingcat investigation and an International Criminal Court investigation and a Dutch police investigation. But in the immediate aftermath, what Russia did was, instead of trying to hide the information, because they knew people would find the information. They instead released a mass of low-tier theories, and sure, people might not have believed most of them, but people might have simply gotten overwhelmed with the amount of information. So Russia is very much aware that people can have the ability to fact check information. So they use a saturation technique a lot of the time. Now, as for the technique they use with their internal audience, they make the propaganda very entertaining. So recently when I tuned into Первый канал, which first channel, it's basically the main Russian channel, which is an experience I don't recommend to anyone who values their sanity, is I expected news. I expected the boring Western kind of type of, sure, it might have propaganda messaging, but I just expected to see a host speaking in front of a screen. But instead there was a constant flood of images, both in the backdrop and edited into the video. There was even a song performed by members of the Russian armed forces in uniform talking about how Russian nuclear weapons will obliterate the West. It was very much filmed like a drama show. And why this is done is to kind of entertain people into actually watching it, and they'll subconsciously take in these messages while they think they're watching the show for entertainment. And one of the main categories of people who watch Russian propaganda in Russia, the internal propaganda, the one that doesn't bother itself with facts, it's just the very emotional opinion, is pensioners who are simply bored of their lives. So the more entertaining Russia can make their propaganda, the more it'll be consumed. And to kind of get back to your question, Jacoby, Russia is very much aware that its propaganda doesn't work on everybody in the same way. So they've become adept at distributing different types of propaganda to different types of people and exploiting the weaknesses of some people over others. And there's a perception that Russian propaganda is just the propaganda that we see on Russian television that only idiots fall for. And that's the perception I kind of wanted to dispute in this space, that no, Russian propaganda comes in many different shapes and sizes. And yes, it can target people in the West, and it can effectively do so.
Go ahead, Michael.
I saw the hand up. I just was going to call on Jane to see if she had maybe a question, perhaps the last. But go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Organizationally, who puts this together? Is there, internal security involved in the internal message and the FSB involved in the external, or is there one group that's doing the whole 9 yards? Thanks.
No, I don't have any insider information. I'm not in the Russian government just yet, but I suspect that both of these are managed by Russian state agencies. But we've also seen Russian private corporations being involved in the distribution of specifically external propaganda. Now, internal propaganda by its nature is just a television show. And most of those television shows are state-run, so there's no real mystery as to who runs the external part. Now, there's a very interesting element to your question is, do different agencies run the external and the internal parts? And yes, to a certain extent, because the government controls the general direction of the internal and the external agenda. But to carry out the external agenda, that is to spread these pro-Russian messages in the West, they very much take advantage of private firms. Now, the most infamous example of this was Prigozhin's troll farm, which has since, I believe, been placed into different, he doesn't control it anymore, but there are many troll farms like that, which basically use people, or that's another interesting point. Will Russia leverage AI to spread these messages? But yes, for external propaganda, they very much use private companies as the foot soldiers of the propaganda. But the general direction of the propaganda comes from the top leadership. Now, if one was to kind of know what direction Russian propaganda was headed in. They should watch the main Russian television channel, the first channel, Первый канал, because that's the channel that gets the instructions first. Because I guarantee you, when the first channel covers a topic, that topic then becomes kind of a talking point for other Russian channels. The external agenda does not have a single topic. The external agenda is very much changing and evolving and adapting to what is the feeling of the day. A lot of the external topics, how they're found, is by looking for pro-Russian speakers in the Western information space and then kind of adapting and promoting their message in different ways that would be advantageous to Russia.
So
Go ahead.
oh, thank you. I would imagine if Kitty were here, she would draw a parallel to some of the things that she sees with the Iranian sources of news and commentary too. They employ a similar technique, which I think is drawn on from Russian techniques used. But I also wanted to just quickly touch on one of the points you wanted to hit too, Stephen, which was the average Russian's opinions of the war in relation to the propaganda they're subjected to, and particularly the propaganda they've been subjected to for years and years, as well as on the exterior of the country, what those if Russians outside of the country, you've been able to gauge opinion in the research that you've been doing, and if you can speak to any ways that you do that research to sort of give context to how it is that you see what you're seeing in opinion.
So part of that is primary research. It's one-to-one conversation with some of these people who I know through channels since before the war, so you can't really replicate that on an academic scale. A great source that I use in my kind of to help my understanding and to contextualize my understanding of the Russian opinion of the war is a Russian YouTuber called Maxim Katz, and I believe one of his videos should be in the nest, and his videos are in Russian but they have English subtitles, so he's a great source if you want to research what anti-war Russians think, and he also makes videos on what the general consensus is. And his general thesis, which I agree with, is that the vast majority of Russians are indifferent to the war. Now, of course, there's a chunk, there's quite a big chunk that are very supportive of it, but I would say probably 60% are indifferent to it, so they just try to pretend to ignore that it's going on. They just want to go on living their lives. But if they were called upon to fight the war or were mobilized, they wouldn't be enthusiastic to undertake this, but they certainly wouldn't resist. And I think, to sum up what general Russian public opinion of the war is, indifference. They try to ignore it. They try to live on their lives, but they do not oppose it in any way. Some of them certainly support it, and those are the people who have been consumed by the pro-Russian propaganda of the television. But most of those people that fanatically support it, that want to destroy Ukraine, that want to genocide every Ukrainian, they're usually people, pensioners and such, who won't actually make a credible effect anywhere. They'll just stay at home shouting these messages and most likely trying to influence their family. But the people that hold radical opinions are usually not in a position to take action. The people that are in a position to take action are usually indifferent to the war. But if they were called upon to take action and directed, they would not resist this direction.
Well, thanks for that, Stephen. One last question from me, not on the propaganda issue, but I'm just curious, as some of these folks who you've been following through, like the War Translated project had been following, closely, like Arestovich and Gherkin and so on, diminish their role or are removed from the field. Is the War Translated project running on more or less the same pace, or do you find that there's an ebb and a flow in terms of how much work you guys are doing translation-wise?
Well, lately I've actually been doing less work, but because Dimitri has been picking up a lot of the slack, because lately the projects that I was working on, I was kind of designated Gherkin, Arestovich, and coincidentally the projects that I was working on actually shut down because Arestovich was fired from his position while he quit, and Gherkin obviously got imprisoned. But in general, War Translated, it's continuing to operate along the same lines. And I've been trying to, instead of translating Gherkin, I've been trying to diversify in terms of other Russian Telegram channels, other pro-war channels. If people want recommendations, the channels that I like to follow are Alex Parker Returns. It's a former Wagner channel who posts opinions. He has contacts on the front. And Повернутая на войне, if anyone speaks Russian, means turned at the war. Those are some of the relevant channels. Fighter Bomber is also an excellent channel. So I'm planning to do more translations of those. But the fact that we've had to change what material we put out really shows that the information space of this conflict is constantly evolving and kind of ebbing and flowing, as is our work to follow it. So the information space is very much non-linear, and it's changing as the war changes.
Jacoby, do you want to come in with the last point?
Yeah, I would just emphasize or try and emphasize for the people in the space that if it's difficult for people who follow this on a daily, hourly basis to follow messaging and disinformation and misinformation and propaganda targeting, then imagine how difficult it is for people who aren't following it to recognize it and to try and conceptualize it and contextualize it in the way that it needs to be to really see what it is, or to not fall prey to it. That if Stephen and War Translated are constantly shifting the way that they do their work, to maybe rethink how you yourself, or me included, look at what we're seeing and taking in and listening to and assessing, and keep questioning it and holding it up to a high standard of interrogation and inquiry yourself. Thank you very much, Stephen, for coming in. I think a lot of the materials you shared, all of the materials you shared, and the channels that you look at, and translate, and all the work that you do at War Translated is really worth looking at and learning from, and following, and questioning too. It seems like everybody there is fairly active and willing to engage in people who are trying to understand, with people who are trying to understand better and do good work. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
And Stephen, I'd encourage you, if you'd like to stick around, we're going to move on to a chat.
I think you have a mic issue, and while Michael fixes that, I think what he was getting at was the next conversation that we're getting to, and I'll let him introduce that. And just in the middle, go to a little bit of housekeeping, that if you like what you've been hearing in the space, please do retweet it and share the conversation elsewhere with the button in the bottom right. Sometimes it's purple, sometimes it's black. And then if you wish to speak in the space, please do hit the mic button in the lower left hand corner, and we'll try and get you up to join the conversation. And certainly if you're able to stick around, Stephen, I know the next conversation is of interest to you too. Please do.
That's right. And so I'm back. Thanks for that, Jacoby. The aspect in the way in which it's related, Stephen, is that we're going to discuss the events in Niger, and that Russia is hard at work with some propaganda efforts there as well. So there is a bit of a tie-in. But we've been joined by a friend of ours, Fabian, who pays close attention to developments in Africa, and particularly that region, has been very busy the last few days following events in Niger. And so I'd like to say, Fabian, thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, hi, good evening. Thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me well.
You're coming through. Yep, you're coming through loud and clear. And so, Fabian, we know you by the reputation of your work, which I've enjoyed following. But we don't know very much about how you come to the issue. So if you would be willing to introduce yourself a little bit at whatever level of detail you're comfortable with, I would love to know how you came to be interested in studying this region.
Yeah, of course, no problem. So basically it started all when Germany decided to join the MINUSMA mission in Mali, and German forces were deployed there. That's basically when my interest in West Africa started. And from that point on, I would say, it evolved a little bit from just the MINUSMA mission to other countries, to jihadist movements and other stuff, aviation stuff, and that's basically the point where I am today.
So I again do appreciate the effort you've gone to digging up little points of nuance in the evolving situation in Niger. I'm wondering, would you maybe just take a minute to explain to us what the current state of affairs is before we get into some of the background? I know that the deadline for the ultimatum was to fall today between ECOWAS and Niger. Can you let us know how things stand?
Yeah, so at the moment, I think it's just wait what happens next, because the nations involved, I think those that have the military power to intervene in the Niger are basically Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast or Senegal. And we're not hearing much from them at the moment. There are rumors about military movements at the borders, that the CNSP, so basically the junta, is trying to reinforce their forces there for a possible intervention. But it's quiet at the moment, I would say, in general.
So it's a little bit of wait and see if they cross the Rubicon, is the phrase, if they actually initiate action. We're happy to have you in that I understand you can give us a little bit of background about the political context in which the coup has taken place. I understand that there was a coup attempt in 2021. Would you be able to explain that to us a little bit, and whether it has any effect on what's happening now?
Yeah, so basically back in 2021, there was the president-elect, Mohamed Bazoum, who is now the president. And I think it was about 2 or 3 days before he got into power. There were some fights in the capital, and I think the coup leaders were part of an unit of the Air Force stationed at the Niamey airport, and they basically tried to overthrow the not yet in power Bazoum, because he was only elected, and the presidential guard actually did their job, what they're supposed to do, and did their thing, and the coup attempt was foiled, and the perpetrators were arrested, but I think they were freed not a long time after that.
But it was carried out by a different set of actors, and were the motivations related at all, or are they independent?
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, maybe Casus Belli can help me out here, as he joined. I think General Tiani was at this time already the leader of the Presidential Guard, and did the thing to foil the coup.
Go
hello everyone. If I can just put some few words. General Chiani was already known for his action back in 2015, if I'm correct, and he was judged by Niger courts in 2018 because he took part of coup attempt. So Niger is kind of used to coup, just like many other countries in the region, but it was kind of a successful democracy there. So unlike a lot of people said on internet and or on TV, it's not like a coup driven by Russia or something. I mean, I remember during the first hours. I mean, the coup took place early on 26 July, and the information was spread on the internet only at like 1 p.m. or something like that. And it was very confused on the first day, and all channels, Russian channels on Telegram and even Russian medias were not talking at all about it. I mean, they were not covering it at all, and they started to put some interest in it only on 27 July, and from that, all the misinformation started to be spread on the internet. So all this stuff let me think that they're not behind it, but they try to capitalize on it, just as I said in some of my tweets. The interesting part is how you have a lot of different countries trying to take advantage of what's happening now.
Well, thanks for that background, and I'm glad that we've been able to assemble a couple of folks with a geopolitical interest or interest in the region, just to speak to the way we're going to work through the material, because we weren't sure which friends of ours were going to be able to join us. Fabian had also given us some material he's worked on, projects of his that he thinks may be influencing the background of the coup. So the way we're going to proceed is I'll call on Piotr in just a moment for his contribution. Then we're going to walk through a few of these background items that Fabian has been working on so that he can help explain how they're relevant to what's happening now. Then I just have a couple of rounds of news updates that hopefully help explain the situation. And since we have a couple of experts with us, that's terrific. And I'll invite you guys to chime in at any point to add additional detail as we work through the news. But Piotr, thanks for joining us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a while. Yeah, good to see you, Fabian. Nice to speak with you. And I'm not going to say it right. Corsus. We've been in touch a little bit. I mean, look, I've got a lot of thoughts running around this. I lived in Ghana for a bit. I know it's not exactly the same as the Sahel, but I look at the Sahel, I look at the western coast of Africa, and there's obviously a lot of dynamics at play here. And I genuinely, my main question, I'm just going to cut to the blunt of it for both of you, is what's the propensity for there to be an actual intervention? Because personally, I remain on the fence about whether or not this is going to happen. The fact that we've got Tinubu, if I'm saying it right, then, let's keep in mind, everybody, that the Nigerian leader has only been in power for 2 months, and he's tried to win the election, I think, twice in the past. So the leadership, and he was very unpopular amongst many Nigerian youths. So, his decision-making has been rejected by the Senate, and generally he's not necessarily reflective of everybody in Nigeria. We've got destabilization or issues in Senegal, although I think they're being overplayed by the misinformation people on in Twitter. So I'm just curious, how do you think that this is going to play out with ECOWAS, both of you? And if we do see an intervention, does this become a sort of proxy war between Russia and Wagner versus ECOWAS and Western entities? And then the other element is, I just think it's quite interesting. We've got predominantly the Francophone elements in the Sahel, but Ghana, Nigeria are obviously remnants of the British Empire. So how much do you think that might play into the psyche, or is that not really relevant at the moment? So yeah, just those couple of questions, and then Michael, if I can follow up in possibly, I'd appreciate it. But thank you.
Sure. So if, I don't know, Cassis or Fabian, we may as well get, I guess, to the bottom line up front. I know that we're in waiting mode. Do either of you have thoughts on how it's likely to play out in, say, the next 2 days, day or two?
Maybe I can start and just want to say sorry to Piotr because he invited me for his space, but I was very busy today, as you can imagine, since the situation was very evolving. So just to answer quickly to the question, I do think they might intervene. From my understanding and from my information, I know some countries have been pushing this option today and the last few days. I don't know when, I don't know where, but what I know this evening is that there's military preparation on some borders. Obviously, I can't develop a lot, but there's some military activities on the Niger border, and they closed their airspace a few moments ago, and they just published a new communique saying that at least two West African countries were preparing their troops. So I think we're getting very close to it, but again, since nothing started yet, we just have to wait and see. And I do think it's probably the worst issue for the region because, as I said in another tweet, you often know how it starts, you never know how it ends. Even if I think it's better for the country to just take down this putschist, I don't believe that. I think that any military intervention would have a lot of impacts on the region, considering that Libya have suffered a lot, and that Algeria is also suffering a lot. Why I'm quoting these countries? Well, it's mostly because they are I'd say, the front line for migrants and all this kind of issues for the Europe. And this is a very huge issue, I think, because it puts a lot of pressure on European politics. And not only that, but it might also create a lot of problems in the region in the future. So for now, I guess we just have to wait, and that's it.
Piotr had also asked the question about, if I understood it correctly, the legacy of the relationship with France. Are we seeing any elements of that at play at the moment?
What can I say is that, of course, if all these countries who were colonized by French have how to say, privilege, I'd say, when it comes to talks with France. Of course, there's strong ties with those countries, just by the fact that they're speaking the same language, which is far easier for us to understand them and to exchange with them. So I'd say, yeah, it have an impact. And for example, this is maybe funny, but in my case, I know far more on all these countries than I know on Nigeria, for the fact that Nigeria was British colonized. So yeah, of course, it have an impact, but overall, I think it's not something that will change anything on potential military intervention.
Sure. Why don't we'll take Fabian for his input on the question, then we'll go back to Piotr for follow-up.
Yeah, just some short additions, because Piotr was asking about Nigeria as well. I just wanted to remember all of us that the president, Tinubu, he said when he became the ECOWAS president that he said he won't allow another coup in West Africa. So he's under a lot of pressure to solve that issue. If it's now in a diplomatic way or an intervention, we don't know at the moment. But yeah, the pressure is up. and I saw a tweet. I have to look it up to edit here maybe. That an aviation nerd, I would say, looked up some satellite images from Sokoto, I think was the name of the Nigerian town. Sokoto, right? It's about 100 kilometers from the Niger border. And he saw 2 fighter jets that were deployed there on the last days. So there is something going on, but I think it's too early to say if the intervention will happen. And yeah.
Well, thanks for that. We always appreciate, breaking insight, whether it's satellite photography, flight tracking, that verifies these things. So if you're able to find it, if you add it to the nest, then we can all follow along on the sourcing. Piotr, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I've got 3 or 4 main points. Number one, of course, as you said, apologies for not being able to make my space. And I'm using that as a launch pad to profusely apologize to everybody who's, seen me make events and then not follow through on them. I've not been on Twitter much, occasionally jumping in and out. So I do intend to get more back to regular hosting. And of course, Fabian, I hope we can have our intended space later on the week to have a deeper dive and build on the great conversation Michael's hosting here. Second, just a Nigerian point. I chatted with David Hoodian, who's a prolific writer, journalist on West African issues. I think he's of Nigerian descent. He's been a very vocal critic of Tinubu and is basically under house arrest, or was potentially under house arrest, to sort of keep out of, very interesting perspective. He's been talking about the balance now Tinubu has to do between, as you said, domestic commitments, but also committing to ECOWAS, which, for everyone's information, is arguably the most regional active organization in Africa other than the African Union. You've got the other one in East Africa and the one in Southern Africa, but they've amounted to very little in the years, and ECOWAS has been the most active in different areas. The third point I just wanted to raise personally is from a diplomatic side. When I was working in the UN team at Crisis Group, we were doing quite a lot of work on the Sahel, and the one thing I came to really appreciate, at least this is to do with Niger, was the fact that Niger was really, really active in the multilateral sphere. They were on the Security Council. They were one of the most vocal, even if it wasn't necessarily to do with Africa. They were very vocal on a lot of issues. They were really pushing a lot of issues, collaborating with the permanent 5 members like Britain or the French. And that's why I think we see a lot of pro-Kremlin or, deliberate misinformation entities on Twitter really framing this argument that it is about, Western influence and interest in the Sahel versus Russia, and it's sort of this vying for power between the two in the context of Niger, and how the people are being liberated from the Western colonialism and finding truth and power in Russia, even though that's not really the case. I mean, the most recent leader was voted in the country's first democratic election. So I don't think it's that clear cut as they try to make it out. And the fourth point, which leads into a question for you both, is just generally, what about the impact on commodities? Niger is obviously I think it's about 4 or 5% of uranium. Russia's been really pushing to try and be the sort of monopoly of energy, of raw commodities in other parts of the world, say the stands in Central Asia. What's your thoughts on that? Is this like a new strategy Russia has, trying to monopolize and control raw materials, or it's a little bit more nuanced than that? Just curious for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Would either of you like to address that question about potential restriction on raw material availability, Cassis or Fabian?
Okay, Fabian, go on.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this topic, but I think Russia was surprised, like a lot of people from this coup. So I don't think there was a lot of background pushing from them to do that. But of course, the uranium is quite a big impact also for the European Union. I think they are importing 15% of their uranium from Niger, which is the biggest nation. We have to see. I think the uranium I learned recently in Niger is like a special quality. So it's better than like, let's say, Chinese or Russian uranium. So at the moment, I think there are no export stops. There were some fake news about them, but I think that's not the truth. So as long as the uranium flows, I think it's not a big issue. And I think France said that they have a lot of stock of that uranium, I think, for the next 1 or 2 years. So it's more about a midterm thing maybe to watch, but I'm not a really expert on that topic.
Okay, so I will just add few information. Like, the main company operating in Niger is named Orano, which is a French company working on uranium in the country. They have 3 big mines, and only one is active actually. They closed the 2 others a few years ago. As said, Fabian, at the moment, Niger did not stop to export its uranium, and it was confirmed on the ground by the company. And also, as pointed Fabian, in France we have 4 years of stocks of uranium. So even if they stopped to export it, I don't think it will have a direct impact, knowing that Canada is our first provider, and there's also Kazakhstan, I think. So we still have the space to act if anything happens. So I don't really think there's any play behind it. Of course, any other country will benefit from taking the position and trying to kick out the French on this mines. But this is clearly not one of the big threat of France, actually. People often forget there was a plan to build a pipeline from, I think, Nigeria, and crossing Niger and then going to Algeria, which will be a gas pipeline. And this is probably one of the biggest plan for Europe, considering there's a lack of gas following the war in Ukraine. And I think we don't face any threats actually. But of course, there's many countries who will benefit from taking our place in the market. I mean, in Niger. And I'm also very amazed by how a lot of people never talk about Canadians in Africa or Australians. I mean, they have a lot of companies. They are nations with a lot of experience in mining. So it's always funny to note that a lot of people talking about French uranium, but never noticing there's far more other countries. And also China have its own mines in Niger. I don't think Russia is trying to do anything that will try to push out France out of here. Their main goal is probably to spread their influence in Africa in the first time, and they don't need to put a lot of efforts because they can just play on the psychological war. They can play on informational war by spreading misinformation, and it doesn't cost them much. And it's very easy for them to use it against France, especially. But overall, I don't think they are behind it. I don't think they're behind the coup. They just filling the gap, if I can say that. They're just taking advantage of the situation, just like many other countries. So I've noticed that there's lots of misinformation coming from Iran, from Syria, and from other countries like Pakistan. So this is just Niger internal affair, and it turned out that lots of countries are now trying to take advantage. And of course, Wagner is a big, I would say, a big element in all these stories. Not that they will have a lot of impact on the ground, but because there's not a lot of Wagner in Mali, which will be probably the country that will provide mercenaries to Niger, if anything. But it will have a lot of impact on the psychological war aspect, and also on whether the West or ECOWAS will take any action or not. And I think this is precisely the point used by Russia to play against us. And I have to say they're pretty good at it, because overall they are kind of living rent-free in our heads, because when anything happens in Africa now, you automatically think about Russia. And I think this is precisely what they want overall.
Yeah, that last point of yours is particularly striking. So having run through that back and forth, because the space has grown a little bit and we have some experts with us, which is terrific, just a reminder that we run through the news, but we try to accent the news heavily with open source material. And so usually what we do is we run through the news points by my putting reference to the sources up in the nest, and then as speakers or listeners are interested, then they come up and we have some discussion around the points. Since we didn't know who was going to show up for the conversation beyond Fabian, it was terrific that he provided us with some material that he thinks has influence as background to the events around the coup. So I wanted to run through what Fabian had provided us with. It's a little bit further back in the nest, which is the area at the top of the Spaces window where the links are posted. But if you were to look back now, I think we're actually working on sort of the 7th or 8th item back. Fabian, a lot of the material that you had provided seems to be connected with the economics in Niger. And so you had provided, for example, there's a tweet, I think it's the 8th back, from the account Milkoto, speaking about a pipeline where Benin is saying that the pipeline won't be impacted by sanctions. I'm just wondering if you could kind of walk us through some of these points you were interested in with regard to the pipeline and the role of China in some projects in Niger. Would love to hear about it.
Yeah, so basically China is a big player when it comes to infrastructure projects in Africa and also in Niger. The President Bazoum was pretty busy meeting with Chinese officials, and the Chinese obviously are very happy to get their share of the projects. Basically, they are very busy in building roads, so that the population can get from A to B a lot faster. It has some economic benefits, and basically, I was asked before our space here why the French or Europeans or US companies are not that popular, I would say, in this business, because the Chinese are basically very fast in their work. They're a lot cheaper than the other competitors, and they're very experienced because they started their growth in Africa and infrastructure projects decades ago. And I found an article a report from the World Bank. I have to look it up. Give me a second where I have it. Oh, yeah. So it's a World Bank prediction that was made last year. And they predicted that China or Chinese companies will have a share of 31% of all infrastructure projects in Africa with a value of $50 million or more. And if they look back in 1990, so basically 30 years ago, European and US companies had a share about 85% of these construction or infrastructure projects. So China is gaining a lot of ground. They're not building only roads, they're also building the pipeline you talked about, which basically runs from the east of the country. It's called the Agadem block. And they're building a pipeline through Niger down to the Gulf of Guinea, next to Cotonou, which is the capital of Benin, or at the seaside basically. And there is also an existing refinery in Sinda. I don't know if I pronounced it right. So the aim is that they, I think, test the pipeline in October or November. That was a statement by a Chinese official, which is connected with the building project. And they basically said, of course, it was before the intervention plans were made or announced, that they expect maybe a minor delay in the project, but they said that all work is continuing and going on. So it's also interesting to see if Benin will deploy forces for this possible intervention that maybe will take place. So they are economically also involved within Niger. And there's also a little bit of a brother fight between Togo and Benin because both have large ports and wanted to get that pipeline. And in this project, Benin was a winner. And basically, if they intervene, I think they will cut into their own leg maybe, because if this pipeline is unfinished, they won't getting their shares from it or their earnings. So we have to see.
Yeah, great points to highlight the interconnectedness of the neighboring countries in terms of economic projects and how that will influence their interaction, including through the potential ECOWAS intervention. Given your reference to how engaged China is, maybe a two-part question being, have we heard the junta in Niger say anything about whether it intends to continue working with international partners like China on infrastructure projects? And have we heard China say anything about what's happening in Niger?
I think for the first point, I didn't mention China yet. I think the focus is at the moment on France and ECOWAS, of course. So we didn't hear a lot of the US talking, CNSP, the junta. And I will have to look up what China said, but I think they were quiet as well, or didn't put out a major statement, but I will look it up in a second.
Okay, well, thanks for that. So again, the material that Fabian had highlighted and was speaking to about those foreign infrastructure projects and the connections with Benin, they're all up in the nest if you're interested in them. So I'll go to a speaker in just a moment, and then what I'm going to do is proceed as I normally do. I have a few blocks on the development of events in Niger that I'll put up just so that you have the background and the sources. And if that inspires any questions or comments that you guys may have, just feel free to put your hands up. I'd love to hear your opinions. But Jane, you did until a moment ago have your hand up. Did you want to go ahead?
I wanted to ask something, but it's sort of a larger question. I'm, hearing China going full force with infrastructure projects and aiding Africa. And I guess my question is, it's not out of the goodness of their hearts. I realize that this is a competition to gain as much control as they can over particularly rare earth minerals, which may not be the Niger question, but I guess I'm curious to know, and I know you both said China has been quiet, but if you had to guess long term, where is China going to try and play this out with Niger, as well as their neighbors?
So I just used the time and looked up China's position, and I found a statement from 3 days ago by the China's foreign ministry. And they said that, quote, they believe that Niger and other regional countries have the wisdom and capacity to find a political resolution to the current situation. So, basically it's a statement like a lot of other nations put out, Western nations, that they want rather political resolution than an intervention. About the other part of your question you asked, Yeah, I'm not sure how they wanna play in the midterm or long term. I think they are interested in stable countries. If this is a military government, or a political government elected by the people, I think doesn't really matter to them, as long as they can, focus on their projects and doesn't get disturbed there. So, yeah, but I'm not an expert on that level. Maybe some other guys in the space have an idea.
Sure. I mean, we're open to any additional insight into China's perspective on things. I think what I'll do is I'll run through a couple of these materials, then I'll go back to Hans. And so I put together some material that is, an overview or a summary. And so if you have a look at the first item in the nest, it's a news article from the Wall Street Journal, which is their overview of the background of events in Niger. And so I suspect that it covers many of the factors that we've already spoken to, including the 2021 coup, some basics of the relationships with neighboring countries, resource issues, and the like. So, if you want the basic background, you have a look at that article. The second item back is actually a thread put together by Cassis, where he asked the question, is this coup a popular uprising, or a popular coup? And he definitely came to the conclusion that no, it is not, and that it's essentially just inspired by one military commander who was going to be removed and replaced, and that sort of got the ball rolling. And that, in fact, there have been several public rallies in support of the president. And so I thought that was an important thread from Cassis to highlight. And of course, if he has any comments in just a moment, feel free to put your hand up and we can take your additional insight. The third item back is linked to the Washington Post article that was written by the, I suppose I'll call him the president, who is in captivity, Bazoum, who, in his own words, said that he has been taken captive and that he is wants to continue ruling, and essentially called on support from allied countries. So you can see the Washington, his own words in the Washington Post. The fourth item back is an article from Le Monde that looks at the motivations of Nigeria's president in sort of leading the charge on the ECOWAS front regarding intervening in Niger. And so it's interesting to see the French perspective and to get a bit of a profile on Tinubu's motivations. So again, it's there for you to peruse at your leisure. Finally, in this block is, sorry, just double checking if I put this up. Nope, sorry, there was one that came up in the middle. We speak to that in a moment. But the sixth item back asks the question, is ECOWAS, in this case, acting as a proxy for France or the United States? And it's a thread that goes into the motivations of some of the other actors in the ECOWAS organization. Obviously, I just mentioned the article profiling Tinubu from Le Monde, but that there are some good points here about motivations from the other regional actors, if you want to check it out. And that's in the tweet in the nest by James Barnett. I think that's it for this block of material. So I'll put up a little bit more. In the meantime, Patty, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Michael. I kind of wanted to field this to, whoever might at the moment have the information. But Jane brought up a very good point. We've been speaking about this probably for like a year and a half, and I have not kept up at the moment. But does anyone have any idea of how much China is holding in as far as like mineral rights and things of that nature? at the moment? Has it increased? Has anything, changed since maybe like a year ago? I think there's a group of us that were speaking about this in a group DM about a year ago, and I haven't really kept up with if things have changed. Does anyone have any information on that? Or Fabian, would you know how that's going?
I would have to look it up by myself also. If there was an increase, and I would guess there was an increase, but I would have to look it up, yeah.
Do you think this would be something that would be very significant? And, how do you see that playing out?
You mean basically China and mining in general in Africa, or especially in Nigeria?
Well, in Nigeria, but in Africa also. I mean, there has been some concern voiced by some of us of this going on, and how they are. We're noticing how they're cornering the market. On the other hand, some are saying, well, they do manufacture a considerable amount more than some other nations, and that would be the reason why they have this interest. But it also, on the other hand, is a double-edged sword, where if there's any other competition from any other countries, this would lock the other countries out from being able to get some of this material.
Well, if anybody has insight into that, then you're welcome to come up and join us. I'm going to keep going with the updates. I note that my co-host Jacoby has been good enough to put up the tweet that Fabian referred to that shows the satellite images of Sokoto Airport and the apparent prep of Nigerian Air Force jets. So that's just to back up his statement that it appears preparations are continuing. So to work through some additional background material, and we'll probably spend about 10 or 15 more minutes on the last of the background on Niger, and then we'll move on to updates on Ukraine. But starting with the second item, back in the nest, for those who aren't familiar with the membership of ECOWAS and the sort of emerging alliances, in that opposed to ECOWAS, there also Mali, Burkina Faso, and others have said they would come to the assistance of Niger to oppose their intervention. So that the map in the nest by War Mapper highlights the various it's rhetorical at this point, but arrayed forces. I also like this tweet because the second image that he's included breaks down the size of the two blocks militaries, and you can see that there would be a huge advantage in terms of manpower and equipment in the ECOWAS group if they do pursue an intervention. The third item back in the nest is a tweet from Jules Duhamel, and he's noting that the junta in Niger is moving ahead with changes to assert control, essentially, including having appointed some new regional governors and some additional military staff. These efforts to cement control will be interesting, given the reporting that the entirety of the armed forces of Niger may not be on board with the coup. And so attempts at leadership change may come to reveal some of those fractures. And I think Jules may actually be with us. So if you have any additional insight, do feel free to come up and add to the conversation. The fourth item back in the nest goes to the financial resources of Niger. And Fabian was speaking to this a little bit with regard to the reliance on some major foreign investors. This tweet is from Michael Shurkin, and it links to a Reuters article that breaks down how approximately 40% of Niger's budget it comes from external partners. And so whether as a result of the imposition of sanctions or just because of breakdown in willingness to provide aid, that could have a massive impact on the ability of whoever comes to rule Niger in their ability to function as a government. So it's important to keep an eye on not just those who may act on the ground, but the attitude of those who support Niger with aid. The fifth item in the nest is to highlight there were reports just after the, I believe it was a day or two following the coup, that there were rolling blackouts in some regions of Niger. And the reports that I saw were claiming that that was because of a reduction in power transferred from Nigeria. But there's a bit of a complicated situation, as I understand it, in that the dam that generates a lot of the electricity in northern Nigeria is on a river that is obviously shared with Niger, and that they have a bit of an understanding in that Niger is similarly working to dam some portions of that same river, and that they have a deal worked out whereby Niger will not reduce the water flow in the river below certain points in exchange for Nigeria's willingness to transmit electricity to Niger. So given the apparent reduction in the electricity exports, this may have down the road effects for Niger's later willingness to cooperate on managing the river flow. These are sort of more complicated diplomatic issues that might not have immediate impact, but when I see these little deep cuts, I like to bring them forward because I think these are the details that are not addressed in some of the major coverage. And so one last point, and then I'll go to hands. The sixth item back in the nest is a tweet from Critical Threats, which is a threat evaluation organization. They work a fair bit with the Institute for the Study of War, and they monitor jihadist movements in several regions, including in Africa. So this tweet links to their report that also highlights several of the countries that have experienced coups in Africa in the last year or two are also regions where apparently jihadist activity is notably increasing, which speaks both to those countries' ability to spare additional troops, Mali, Burkina Faso, potentially to aid Niger, but also to the risks that flow from continued instability in the country. So you guys may appreciate some insight into those developments. But I'll go to Piotr. Go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, I lost connection, but wanted to jump back in because I think this is... despite the amount of people who are talking about it, I'm surprised it's not being covered enough in mainstream media, at least front page news, because if the Sahel collapse, like we've got a multi-state significant warfare and a very multifaceted one at that on our hands, and it's something we don't want to see. But yeah, just to what you were talking about, when I was living in Ghana, one of the things that was very notable for me was because it was this was several years ago now, like 2016, 2015, 2016, something like that. And this is the peak of ISIS. So you had the French had launched their counterinsurgency or counter-terrorist operations in the Sahel in 2013, and we were sort of seeing the peak of the Islamic growth around that time. And I remember living in Ghana because it was one of the more politically stable countries in the region. Nigeria is the largest economic powerhouse, but Ghana was seen as the more politically savvy. And one of the biggest things was how much extent does the foreign or international community get involved. This was before Wagner was really a known entity, and sort of the West, and before BRICS, the BRI had really taken off under China. So the West still, at least France, it was largely France's backyard sort of thing. So now I'm just, for me, the question, and Fabian, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this or anyone else, but it's sort of like, Why now? Why Niger? Why not with Mali? Why not with Burkina Faso? Why are we suddenly seeing such a staunch activity from ECOWAS, but also, the French and other countries in defiance to what's happening in Niger? There were statements given and the typical diplomatic activity after the other coups in the past couple of years, but never this amount of activity. So I'm just curious why we think now. And then the other point I just think is rather important is also because there's been a lot of ideas floated around something called the Trans-Saharan pipeline. Nigeria has a lot of oil reserves in the southeastern region. I think it's called Biafra. And there was a an internal civil war, effectively, in the 1960s, I believe, Nigeria. And the idea is that they want to take these oil fields and gas fields, I think there's a mixture, up through Niger into Algeria and then obviously utilised for European needs. And that's why a lot of, again, pro-Russian voices are saying that this is all a neo-colonialist Western, desire to control these gas corridors and so on. So I'm just curious how much that this is sort of why the West. Is there some truth, I guess, to sort of what they're saying, or is it literally just because we're seeing such a rise of Wagner and all this sort of stuff? So I don't know. I just wanted to chuck those ideas into the fray because I think they're really important to keep in mind because when we talk about wars, narrative is really important as much as the actual kinetic warfare itself. So just wanted to chuck in those ideas into the pot. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, Fabian, do you have any sense on why there wasn't more effort to intervene in Mali or Burkina Faso, as opposed to what's happening now?
Yes, I think ECOWAS was kind of used of it to the coups, and they did impose sanctions, and I think they increased the sanctions over the time when they noticed, okay, it doesn't get better, or the coup plotters are not going to step down. And I think they learned from both countries that, I think sanctions are one thing, but the sanctions are only hitting the people that live there because they do not have access to their money, to their bank accounts. They cannot get money. They are impacting their daily lives, like we see now in Niger with the electricity cuts. So they had to think about something else, what they can do. And the only thing that impacts the coup plotters themselves is kind of forced to push them out. And I think ECOWAS learned from the last two coups. I'm not familiar a lot with the coup in Guinea, but I think they saw that the coups in Burkina Faso and Mali also led to an increase of Russian influence, and I think they just don't like it or want it maybe. So that's another point. And I just saw an AFP message or notification that France announced that they will cut all aid to Burkina Faso. So that's another development here. And about the pipeline, I'm not that familiar to talk about that topic reliable.
Fair enough. Piotr, do you want to follow up, and then we'll go to Jacoby?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll relinquish the mic after this. But so the other couple of questions I have is, one point I want to raise and then ask your thoughts, Fabian, if you have any on it, is another thing I was working on quite a lot in the past few years in an African context was climate change. Particularly, there was a study released in 2021 over Nigeria, but it largely crosses into Nigeria's southwestern area and northeast of Nigeria, so where Boko Haram is largely present, which was climate insecurity. So there was a lot of intercommunal violence between herders and farmers because obviously the aridity of the land, as the Sahel, the desertification intensifies due to climate change. The amount of arable land available to herders and farmers diminishes, so they're beginning to increasingly compete and unfortunately conflict over this land. So I was just wondering, in the case of Niger or just this area, is there an element of climate change that is also driving grievances amongst local populations, which is why they might gravitate towards a non-democratic government, for example. And then more broadly on that, do we actually have any data about what the general sentiment is regarding the situation? Right, we've seen out of context videos of African groups chanting, holding Russian flags, but is there a sense of whether there is a strong support for this coup amongst the populace, or it's largely seen as forgetting what the elected officials and media is saying? What do the actual people on the ground feel about it? Is it quite close, or is there much more staunch opposition versus support? Because I'm not familiar with that. So just thoughts on those two things would be really interesting.
Yeah, just shortly. I would say it's very hard to tell, because in Niamey there are all the Western journalists, there are the TV station, the national TV station, and the country is very big. And I think in the past week we only heard a lot of reliable stuff only from the capital, and we don't know how it impacts the other regions like Agadez or the Tahua region. There were in the beginning some pro-Bazoum protests, but I think the junta just announced some days later that they won't allow demonstrations. And I think today or yesterday was another pro-coup plotters or CNSP demonstration in Arlit, which is a town near to the uranium mines. So it's hard to tell, because there are no polls obviously asking the population, because just a huge country. So hard to tell. And climate change, of course, is also a topic in the region, even though it's a desert region. Like Mike pointed out, the project with the dam on the Niger River, it's also affecting the communities who are basically living down upstream and are dependent on the rainfall and on how much water is getting through there to water their fields. And the cattle market is also a point, or animal market, which is suffering from heat waves and not so much rain. So it's affecting them. This thing will affect them in the midterm much harder as they are already affected now.
Thanks for that. So we'll go to Jacoby and then to Skate Park. Go ahead, Jacoby.
Thanks. To the question about, why would there be an effort to intervene relatively quickly after a coup in Niger and not so much in Mali or neighboring countries? I would posit the possibility of the influence of resources that are available and desirable by countries that would intervene, and powerful countries that would intervene. You see that in Niger, partly, because of the resources as well as because of the, I think we've heard OPSEC say this many times, and people are also referring to it in writing, the two air bases that are located in Niger, the U.S. air bases. And, there is a significant presence there. There has been a significant presence in that country for several years. And that presence doesn't exist in neighboring countries. And I also just put up a thread from Tatarigami UA, who often, as we know, posts about Ukraine and the strategic importance of Niger and neighboring countries. And I lost my second thought, so I will defer to Hans.
Sure. As he's our guest on the issue, we'll go to Fabian first. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention that the U.S. base in Agadez was built by the Americans or by the U.S., but they have an agreement that the Americans are only using it for a period of time, I think. So basically, they said in this agreement it's a Nigerian or Niger air base, but for extent of time it's used by the US military. I don't know how often they can say, okay, we stay another 10 or 5 years. But basically the US invested, I think, over $100 million to build it there. And in the midterm or long term, or maybe short term, if the US has to leave the country as well, it will benefit Niger. But of course, you're right. The resources are a big point there. But Burkina Faso and Mali also have quite large gold resources. So, yeah, we have to weigh gold against uranium. But yeah, I got your points.
I know we have a couple of hands up. Hopefully you guys will be patient for just a moment. I'm going to run through these additional points in the nest, and then we'll go back to hands. So this is a block of material I put together on some foreign influence. We've referred to some of this a little bit already, but in this way you have some sources. So looking, starting with the second item in the nest, it's a tweet from Cassius Belli, who, by the way, had to leave us just because there were so many developments, but he sends his apologies for having to depart, where he's saying that there are now reports that there are some Wagner mercenaries who are present in Niamey. And I'm not sure how to take that in light of reports from other reliable accounts. So if you have a look at the third item in the nest, a tweet from Jules Duhamel, where he's saying that there's an ongoing disinformation campaign about the deployment of mercenaries from Mali toward the border with Niger. Now, I think it's possible to read Cassius's tweet and Jules' tweet together, in that Jules is referring to a deployment toward the border, possibly in larger numbers, where it sounds like Cassius is suggesting that there may be just a small group. In his quote tweet there, he refers to it as the possible arrival of just a team. But I don't know whether these two reports are actually opposed to one another. So if anybody has more insight into what's likely on this point, please do let us know. The fourth item back in the nest is highlighting some additional apparent, political disinformation being spread by a Russian agent by the name of Alexander Malkovich, who actually is fairly well known, and he has a reward for his capture of $10 million for interference in U.S. elections. And the fact that he's out here now engaged in discussing the events around Niger is, quite interesting. I've seen some, there were many threads in the initial days after the coup highlighting that it was not inspired by Russian interference, but certainly that Russia may be attempting to engage in ways to capitalize on the disorder, if only to distract, the Western countries it sees as its opponents. The fifth item back, so these last 2 points are about France. The fifth item back goes to the fact that France has now completed its evacuation, having evacuated nearly 1,100 people. I know that several other countries have issued either strong travel warnings for Niger or conducted partial evacuations. My understanding is that the U.S. evacuated some of its staff, its diplomatic staff, and that the U.K. issued, some strong warnings. I understand one or two other European countries have also sent aircraft to begin evacuations of their diplomatic staff as well. But on the French front, finally in this block, the sixth item back is an article from the UK Times that has some insight into frustration between Macron and the political leadership in France and the French intelligence agency, the DGSE. And I saw in some coverage of this that apparently the DGSE, there were reports that the DGSE, seeing that there were likely to be dangerous developments in Niger, suggested the deployment of troops to, I believe, the presidential palace, but that for the appearance of political reasons, their advice was not followed. And I guess there's now, because since that's become public, there's now some frustration between those two branches of the French government. Because I saw Piotr's hand go up in response to the last point on the French intelligence issue, I'll go to Piotr, but then we'll go around in order. Go ahead, Piotr.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to, on that immediate point, we had our chat with Tara Varma from Brookings about French politics a few months back, and you just reminded me of something she said, which is that at least when you talk about French foreign policy in the Sahel, you know, a lot of people see it as a neo version of colonialism because France tried to keep that, I forget the exact term, but the currency situation, and there's been a lot of internal confliction between French intelligence services and the polity, or the political system, and the frustrations over the intelligence services basically being frustrated with the lack of progress that the French have had in the Sahel region over the best part of a decade. And, you know, also that we went from a pretty left-leaning, useless head of state, Francis Hollande, to Macron, who's been incredibly pro-Europe, one of the most vocal in a sort of more conventional interventionist, pro-democracy sort of sense. You know, we can see that somehow he's been with Ukraine and other things. So a lot has changed in France domestically in the past 10 years, which has influenced the way that it operates its military activities abroad, in most notably in the Sahel. It was largely a French operation. It wasn't like the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali was the most deadly, but it was largely French in charge. So I just wanted to add that context to what you said about the grievances or frustrations of one side of the French intelligence versus the political system, because a lot has happened, and Macron was only re-elected last year on a very weak platform. You know, it was the best of the worst, basically. So France is not in the strongest position as the former colonizer to really sort of dictate terms here, and so it is largely left to African states to sort of come up with the options. And if Nigeria can't get itself together and ECOWAS has internal divisions, you know, it's not going to be easy to see how this operation is successful, even if it goes ahead. So that was all I wanted to add. Thank you.
I appreciate the context. So we'll go in order. I think it was Skatepark, Jane, and then Murtala. Go ahead, Skatepark.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to give a short context on some of the things going on in the Sahel, because there's a sort of ever-present tension between stationary farmers and nomadic and semi-nomadic people in the Sahel, and they are of course affected by rainfall and climate and seasonal variations. But something else that is also going on is that the improvement of veterinary medicine is making it possible to move cattle even further south in the Sahel into Nigeria and stuff like that. So that has increased conflicts between stationary farmers and semi-nomadic and nomadic people who can move further south than they otherwise could have, and that's because of improved veterinary medicine. Something else that also is going on is that in northern Mali, has been an independence movement by people in northern Mali who have sort of been I think they had a sort of a peace agreement with the rest of the government in Mali. But if some sort of conflict kicks off now, do you think they will join on the ECOWAS side? That's more a question I have.
Sorry, just your last point. Will who join on the ECOWAS side? I didn't catch the
in northern Mali. The Tuaregs in northern Mali. The independence.
I mean that. I don't know if that question goes too far afield. Fabian, do you have any thoughts on whether this could become complicated if Mali supported Niger? Whether their internal opposition might take that opportunity to act?
I mean, the Tuareg group has a little problem because they were forced into the borders we have now. And I think they are living in Mali, Niger, Algeria, and some parts of Libya as well. So they don't necessarily look at the borders like we do. But I'm not sure if they already communicated something about their position. They do have some political arms or organizations. They put some opinions out, but I'm not sure on which side they are gonna end in the end. They are very independent focused, and if they had the opportunity, I think they would look for an independent. I think they call it Azawad. I'm not sure if they call it in the right saying, but yeah, I don't know about their opinion in general about the coup in Niger.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I appreciate that as this could potentially become more of a regional issue, that it can draw in political views from many of those other partners. We're just going to stay focused on Niger for now, as the central issue. But I imagine that folks like Piotr do great jobs hosting geopolitical spaces where they can go into sort of more depth or more breadth on some of those other regional actors. I'm going to go to Jacoby as co-host and then to Jane. Go ahead, Jacoby.
Yeah, just quickly, I don't want to get too far into it, but if it's the groups that I'm thinking of, they're not new groups in Mali, and they do cross over into Niger and Algeria and southern Libya, and their independent-minded views are, from my recollection, nothing new, and they would, I'm sure, take opportunities to take action, but it doesn't strike me that they would ally. They don't traditionally, and haven't previous to this had any inclination towards allying themselves with something like ECOWAS. But that would be sort of far afield from the general discussion here, I think, to go any further.
Because his hand just popped up, it may be in response. I'm going to go to Piotr, but Piotr, if you can make it quick, just because others have been waiting.
No. It was just a broad observation. Go to the others. I'll wait.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Jane.
Sure. Two things. Just as a data point, the U.S. built the base where the drone activity takes place. There's actually two different bases, and while there is an agreement with Niger on ownership and whatnot, the United States military has got, as of yesterday, 1,100 people still at that base, and it has not stopped operating. So my guess is, while they have had AID people moved out of country and a fair number of the diplomatic staff that are non-critical moved, I think that the general consensus is to hold firm, because that is a very, very necessary base. And it was used initially for the global war on terrorism, so it is supported by a large number of nations as far as its presence there. Anyway, just as an FYI, and one thought here is I'm just curious about China's sort of outsized influence on trying to get hold of control of as much of the rare earth minerals as they can in Africa. And they are building infrastructure everywhere, which helps them and helps the folks of any given nation get around. But I'm just curious to know what Fabian, I guess Cassis is bailed out, but I'm curious to know what, from the larger picture sense, people think about China's involvement with Niger and where China's involvement with Africa is headed, with, Wagner in there as a consideration. Thank you.
So Fabian, you're getting asked lots of questions about mineral rights and interests. I know often you've said you'd have to look it up. Do you have any insight into the rare earths and their concentrations in Niger?
No, I'm having some technical issues here. I don't think you hear me correctly, but as I said, yeah, China is not the point I looked up. Mainly in particular, just for the infrastructure projects. So yeah, same answer. I would have to look it up, but I provided Patty with a link, and I think Jacobi has it also. There is a recent report about China's mining activities in Africa. Maybe that's helpful for the first read.
Thanks for that. Skate Park, you appear to put your hand up in response to this question. Do you want to come in just briefly?
Yes, just a quick note on the rare earth. I think that's a bit of a detour because rare earth minerals are not actually that rare. Inside China has a lot of deposits, also in countries like the United States, Scandinavia, other places. Actually, in mine waste from the United States, you can find a lot of rare earth minerals. And the reason they're not being extracted right now is that China's are cheaper. So I think I think it's a bit of a. I don't think China is really interested in rare earth minerals in Africa for that reason, but they might be interested in the general economic activity.
Thanks for that. Murtala, would you like to go ahead? And by the way, I've followed your coverage of this matter too, so I appreciate you joining us.
Hello. Yes. Quite insightful conversation, and I was speaking on a couple of things. One of the questions asking why the different direction in terms of ECOWAS response to the situation in Niger, and then also I'll be speaking about the importance of Niger. What's different in Niger this time around is the fact that Nigeria had an election recently, and we have a new leader who has a different posture towards the ECOWAS region and the concerns around the coup. In fact, just a few weeks before the coup in Niger, he had talked up very strongly against coup in the region, saying that the ECOWAS needed to strengthen its standby force to counter the epidemic of coup, to paraphrase his words, and then also to counter terrorism in the region. And then the coup in Niger happened. Niger was also very close to Nigeria, a very key partner. Apart from the social and cultural connection between Niger and Nigeria, the two countries are involved in counterterrorism operations in the Lake Chad region, and also anti-banditry operations around the border areas in the southwestern area. So there's a lot of concerns around what happens in Niger for Nigeria, and probably some of the issues that have shaped why Nigeria was really, really concerned, and concerning the fact that under President Bazoum, Niger has continued to be a very strong partner. There's been a lot of progress in terms of counterterrorism in Niger, and also addressing some of the key grievances in terms of development interventions. Some areas of the Lake Chad communities have begun to be resettled, thanks to the improvement in security in that region. Contrary to something what the coup plotters were trying to insinuate, we all know that part of the reason was the power play in Niamey, and the fact that the presidential guard commander was felt like his job was about to slip away. So this is a really this part of the dynamics, the position of Nigeria in terms of what's happening in Niger. The second concern is that if ECOWAS does not intervene in Niger, there will be more coups in the region. It's almost like a wave, and who is going to be next? And I think that's partially why some of the other head of states are also in support of an intervention, because they are concerned that it could be the next, and if ECOWAS will not do anything in terms of Niger, then their situation could really get bad. However, Nigeria is currently facing some bit of political struggles in terms of intervening, because without Nigeria committing to intervene in Niger, it will be extremely difficult for any form of ECOWAS intervention to happen. Nigeria plays a huge bulk in terms of any form of intervention historically in the region, whether going back to the intervention in Liberia and more recently Gambia in 2017. Although the intervention in Gambia in 2017 was a more smaller one, with Senegalese providing a huge chunk of the intervention force. However, in any form of intervention, Niger will have to have Nigeria's commitment, deployment of large numbers of forces, and also provision of resources. So for now, the Nigerian government is trying to find a way to get political backing internally. If that does not happen, then that could be a huge stumbling block. And we know from what's happening now that the French and Americans would likely not be intervening. They will likely want it to be an ECOWAS intervention, and that, so that it stays that way and removes any possibility of the imperialist conversation that is happening. And we're all seeing that in terms of disinformation from Russian-related accounts. So that's really another concern. And so when we also talk about the strategic nature of Niger, it's been an increasing important counterterrorism ally, not just for ECOWAS in terms of fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS-related groups, but also for the Americans. We know that Americans in terms of the DoD, the CIA, and contractors operating at least 3 bases in Niamey, Agadez, and Doku, where they have been doing operations either in Niger, the Lake Chad, and also in Libya. Although the operations in Libya have reduced a bit, and that's I think more recently, I think satellite images shows that the base in northern Niger had reduced in terms of activity. So most likely because the Americans had to reduce their operations in Libya. So, however, Niger really has been a very important partner, and following also the situation in Mali, where a lot of the French were kicked out and all that, the fallback has been Niger and Chad. So yeah, it's really an interesting time that we are in, and the next coming hours will really determine a lot of things on what ECOWAS does.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate the local perspectives, and I know that you follow the security developments there pretty closely. And I know from a few spaces that I've been in that it seems like while there are Twitter spaces held by Africans to discuss African issues, it does seem like overall there's a lack of coverage for matters in the region. So I'm glad we can get into some of the discussion about it. We gathered a bit of a crowd, probably because it's a less commonly discussed subject, but we're coming toward the end of the material on Niger, but I suspect that there's a bit of a crowd. So if somebody wanted to open a space to continue the discussion on Niger, I suspect there's an opportunity there. But Piotr, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I would. No, I appreciate Myrtle's points. Very astute on all of it. I mean, the one thing I wanted to point out from, well, 2 points actually, is for everyone who's interested in geopolitics, but maybe a bit more, of a beginner, is Prisoners of Geography. It's a really good book by a chap called Tim Marshall, who I've chatted with in the past, and he basically emphasizes literally the geographical location of something. So like Turkey, for example, is so important because it borders, North Africa, Europe, Asia, and so on. Russia is important just because it's so massive. And so Niger is really interesting because it's literally in the center of the Sahel. So from a geostrategical standpoint, it's close accessibility to loads of different issues. So for the Americans, who, I can't remember which speaker said they've got about 1,100 troops, I think, and 700 or 600 French, it's hugely just convenient, like just proximity-wise, right? If you want to conduct a quick operation or support another entity for whatever reason quickly, it's really well placed. And so sort of particularly Niger, has been prioritized over anywhere else in certain ways. And then also because it is literally sort of, I looked at the democratic index, I think it's got one of the highest democratic strengths relative to other parts of Africa, Botswana, Ghana being another 2 examples, for instance. So, but surrounding it, you've got how many entities of Wagner influences, as others have already pointed out. So you've got this sort of growing pincer movement, if you like, sort of surrounding Niger and other countries in a gradual sense. And then the other thing I just wanted to sort of take note of, I mean, if people pointed it out, but for me, it is quite interesting. Compare this to the Horn of Africa. How many foreign interventionary entities are there in the Horn? We've got the Gulf states, i.e. the UAE, Saudi Arabia. We've got Turkey. We have Russia. We have the West in the collective sense to a certain extent. We've got Egypt, Kenya, sort of the UN entity. Western Africa, there aren't that many middle powers that are really there. You've got Nigeria as the giant of Africa, as it's been known, but sort of it's still sort of basically there's not many non-African entities here other than the French and the Americans to a tiny extent that are prevalent here. China is there in an economic sense, but they're not going to get involved or do anything military. I doubt they're going to start supplying military arms to Mali or Burkina Faso for whatever reason. So it's fascinating to see, how this develops, hopefully peacefully or diplomatically, because, once you see a power vacuum begin to emerge, for better or for worse, the French were sort of keeping things sort of largely directioned, right? I'm very conscious what this means for African countries to lead, let's say, an intervention goes ahead. What does this mean for African competency as a multinational effort to combat what they see as an existential or regional threat to their own democracies or whatever power leadership structures? So those are just a couple of things that I found very interesting in this vis-a-vis other regions or sub-regions in Africa. And again, I hope it plays out peacefully. But thanks a lot for this. A really interesting conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Piotr. Deep questions there. And for those of you who don't know, Piotr will host spaces on broad geopolitical issues. And he indicated earlier in our conversation that he may hold some to discuss these ongoing events later in the week as more details emerge. So I would suggest keeping an eye on his account for that. But I see that in response, Murtala wants to come back in. So go ahead, Murtala.
Yeah, so I oftentimes will forget also that Nigeria is almost like one of the most important European allies in terms of containing migration. Nigeria plays a huge role providing that buffer, and over the years it's been getting a lot of resources to do that. And I guess this will be one of the major concerns that will be going on in various European capitals. What happens to this security concern for them in terms of migrants heading to Europe, to Nigeria?
Yeah, that's an important point. I don't think we had brought up yet. So what I'm going to do is I had one last sort of block of 4 or 5 points to make. These are more miscellaneous points. Because I know a lot of our audience had come out to listen to the discussion about Niger and Africa more broadly. You may be new to the space, so I'll just remind you that we do hold conversations twice a week on breaking news, but that we try to accent with open source information from here on Twitter. And so the first item, or it's actually now the second item in the nest, is the invitation to our next space, which will be Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern time, New York time. So you can set your reminder if you'd like to come out and hear our conversation next time. So I'll run through these last points, then we'll get into some updates on Ukraine. Normally we run the conversations for 3 hours. We're nearing the end of that. I think I'll run for maybe another half an hour, just so I can touch on some of the latest developments in Ukraine. But if any of my co-hosts or other supporters can't hold on, then I totally understand that. So I'll start with the third item, back in the nest. Again, a tweet from Casus Belli. Where it was details that he worked to uncover about some cooperation between the coup plotters in Niger and the juntas in Mali and Burkina Faso. And apparently, while flight trackers noted the flights from Niger to those countries after the coup, the allegations now been made that there may have been contacts between those groups prior to the coup as well. And so you can see the Casus Belli had linked through to the article by African Intelligence, which I've seen break several interesting stories in the last few months. The fourth item, sorry, just doing some admin things in the background. The fourth item in the nest is a statement that was put out by the M62 opposition movement in Niger. And their statement had argued that they should hold foreign nationals from various European countries as hostages in order to force foreign forces to leave. Now, I bring this up, it's been a few minutes, but I bring this up in the context of the ongoing evacuation efforts by France, the United States, and a handful of other European countries that appear to have been fairly successful, and there wasn't interference with them. So it seems like this call from M62 was not heard. And I see that we've been joined by OSINT Defender, who's done a great job at tracking the ongoing evacuation efforts in Niger. The fifth item in the nest I include just because one of the major regional players from a military perspective is Algeria, which borders Niger, I believe it borders Niger on the north, and they're one of the most significant militaries. But their Ministry of Foreign Affairs has put out a statement essentially saying that they'd like to see the matter resolved peacefully, but that they won't be taking steps to intervene. This statement was 5 days ago. As far as I know, this is their last word on the matter. They are not aligned with ECOWAS, or in either direction. And so people were looking to them just because they could potentially be a weight that would influence how the situation would unfold. But it looks like they are going to watch from a distance. Two last points here. So the sixth item back, again, a tweet from Casus. This is his breakdown about how he foresaw things going immediately after the coup occurred, essentially saying, it struck me that it's a wide chasm between these possible outcomes, essentially saying that ECOWAS might back down on following through with its ultimatum, in which case it would lose quite a lot of political power, diplomatic power, or that ECOWAS would intervene, but that, in Casus' opinion, this could contribute to potentially decades of instability in the region. And I thought it interesting that he didn't really contemplate sort of a middle possibility where there's a successful intervention that results in increased stabilization. So it's unfortunate he's not here to speak to it. But when he was with us earlier, he did suggest he thinks ECOWAS is likely to follow through with an intervention in the near term. As a final point before we go to hands, the seventh tweet back in the nest links to an article, a French language article, just discussing
I think there might be a mic issue that Michael has. I will just take a minute, pardon my voice, to remind people to retweet the space and also request the mic if you have a question. And I do see Piotr's hand is up. Just going to you. Go ahead, Piotr.
Thank you. I can speak. Well, I dealt with the African Union a little bit as part of Crisis Group again, and I wanted to jump in on this because I see Defender's joined, and he just shared an interesting tweet about the propensity for the AU to supply troops. Now, from my, again, very brief but still fieldwork experience, the AU is a lot like the UN in that it's a big, complicated body, that it suffers from a lot of institutional challenges. It's bloated. There's a lot of internal divisions over transcontinental issues like food insecurity, water scarcity, climate change, so on. One of the biggest notable events they actually managed to do was impose, I think they suspended Sudan when the coup happened in 2021. I think that was a pretty notable event. But other than that, they do struggle to literally push through effective policy. So for there to be a cross membership consensus to supply troops in any event of an intervention would be quite significant. Their goal first and foremost is to be a place like the UN to debate things peacefully and avoid to push peacekeeping and making. So I think that's really, I'd be very, very curious to see how that sort of developed. Michael's point about ECOWAS being effectively redundant if it failed on this entity is very true. The Horn of Africa regional body, I forget what the acronym is called, has largely been seen as this. It's failed to achieve any of its mandates, and ECOWAS is, I think, largely seen as the most effective regional body. So it's again, the sort of the whole idea of, even in the 2000, the Organization of African States, I think it was called, was seen as an attempt, and then the African Union basically was born out of that. But transnational, multilateral effectiveness in the continent has been pretty low. So in this context, I struggle to see how that would really play out more than it hasn't already, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to add that in there because it's I'd love to see it work, but I don't see it, unfortunately, really being the case.
Well, thanks for that, Piotr. And I see that you, I think you have rescheduled your space with Cassis. So it's up in the nest. It's the fifth item back. If you're interested in hearing more about Niger and the Sahel, do check out that Spaces invite that Piotr has put up there, as he'll continue the conversation down the road. Sorry for dropping out there. I was just making the last point that it's unfortunate that it's come to this point that it seems like intervention is imminent. Whether you think it's the right policy or not, just making the point that as Cassis and others seem to identify, that by moving to military action on a regional basis, it does have the potential to unleash other forces that may lead to instability. It's just hard to see where it ends. But hopefully a solution is found, even if an intervention is required. Hopefully a solution is found with minimal need for fighting. And so I think what we're going to do is move on to some brief updates on what's happening in Ukraine. Because we're over time, I'll probably put about half an hour into that, just to do high level on one or two developments in the last few days. Before I move on, I'd like to thank Fabian very much for coming to chat with us. I appreciated you highlighting some of the economic issues that you see as contributing to the background motivations behind the coup, and for answering so many of our questions. So thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And as this issue evolves, whether you speak with Piotr or whether we follow up on it in a week or two, depending on how things unfold, would love to have you back with us. So the first set of material for updates on Ukraine that I'll speak to will be the Black Sea, developments in the Black Sea. Now, I'm not going to go into it in a huge amount of detail by breaking out the individual tweets. And I'm doing that partly because my co-host, Exit, follows this issue closely, and she has scheduled a space tomorrow to discuss it in a bit more depth. So, rather than do a poor job in advance of the excellent conversation that she's having, we'll only go into it briefly. So you can set your reminder for her space as the first item in the nest. But what I've done is the second, third, and fourth entries in the nest are sort of my blocks of material. So if you have a look at the second item in the nest under the tweet headed Black Sea, you'll see that in there is exit summary of what happened over the 4th and 5th of August, because there were quite a lot of developments all at the same time, and it will give you great background for her space. But essentially, the Ukrainians had declared that several Russian ports will, from their perspective, now be closed, and that any Russian ships traveling to the northeast portion of the Black Sea would be at risk as being treated as if they were carrying, materials in support of the war. Which language I think the Ukrainians chose to mirror the Russian declaration. And so just over the 4th and 5th, there were two separate attacks by unmanned surface vessels. And they both caused significant damage to ships, one of which caused damage to an arms-carrying cargo ship, a roll-on, roll-off, or ro-ro ship. I believe it's a Rapucha class landing ship, and the other of which is an oil tanker named the SIG that had apparently in the last several months been engaged in carrying flight fuel to Russian forces in Syria. And so included in this tweet, again, I think it's the third back in the nest under the heading Black Sea, you can see there's a breakdown list of all of the existing USV attacks from our friend David Helms. You can see the Ukrainian notice about the closing of ports. And I've included some material on the attack on the SIG tanker, including video, photographs showing damage to the ship, and then an argument about why it can likely be considered a military target, given its support of Russian military activity in Syria. If you have a look at the next tweet in the nest, and sorry, actually that we're now on the third, starting with the Gornyak video, this is some additional source material on the attack on the landing ship. So that first tweet under the phrase Gornyak video from our friend Sam Bendet, who did a summary thread on the attack on that ship. And then you'll see as you look down at the other links that there's sort of a battle damage assessment by seeing that the ship made it to port, but that it's listing heavily, apparently leaking fuel, and that it has several other sort of assisting ships, some tugs, and I think there's a floating crane, efforts to keep it afloat. However, despite all that, you'll see there's a phrase in there that says repairable, ? And that's from the account of Rachel Pauling, who is actually a ship designer, a naval designer, who breaks down the likely structures of the ship that were damaged. And her assessment at the end is that the list may be because of an uneven set of spaces that are necessary on a landing ship because of the landing dock area, but that it's likely those areas aren't critical and that the ship may be capable of being repaired. There's also a list of the overall status of the Rapucha class in there. It's from our friend M.T. Anderson, who follows the fact that there are apparently 9 known Rapuchas that would be in the Black Sea, and he does a breakdown of their availability, in that several are either in for repair or have now been sunk or damaged, greatly diminishing Russia's ability to move vehicles through the Black Sea. And then finally in that tweet, there's a link to a thread by our friend Marcus Johnson, who's tracking the location of what is expected to be the next to arrive arms-carrying ship, which is the Sparta, what is it, the Sparta 4? Oh, no, excuse me, it's the Lady R. And so that's one to keep an eye on. And Marcus is of the opinion that that ship may enter the Black Sea in the next 10 to 15 days. And I'm sure that would be an attractive target to the Ukrainians if there's still ongoing conflict in the Black Sea at the time. Exit, do you want to go ahead?
Just two quick clarifications. It's my understanding that the Rapucha class ship is no longer leaking fuel. I think we saw some satellite images today that seemed like they had that under control. So just ecologically, that's great. And then the Lady R has done other trips in the past, but this particular trip that it was on was to China, and it's very unclear exactly what it's carrying or if there's kind of any proof one way or another. And so it'll be important to watch as it goes through the Bosphorus Straits, because hopefully Yorick will be able to, I'm sure Yorick will have content and video of that particular ship, and there might be a way for us to assess what's actually on the ship, which would give us a better understanding of what it is carrying and whether it's actually a viable target.
Yeah, thanks for those clarifications. Then the last tweet with material for the Black Sea, it's the fourth item back in the nest. This one's a bit of a grab bag, including observation, again, by our friend Marcus, that there was a recently, opened Roskvardia naval base near the Kerch Strait, or in the southern portion of the Kerch Strait, that Marcus believes is intended to protect the bridge and surrounding shipping, but obviously it wasn't able to prevent the attack on the SIG. But it's interesting that Russia may be beefing up its efforts at protection in the region. There's also just a profile of the Magura 5, which is the name for the USV, the latest generation of USV that has been developed. And so there are some stats there on the vessel in the tweet from Christian Trubert. Then in this tweet, there are a couple of background bits of data, if you want to dig into it, including the tweet from Robin Brooks about the importance of the ports of Novorossiysk and the CPC terminal for the sheer volume of oil that Russia exports from them. And it's significant. It's probably significant to Russia's overall budget revenue. To keep that oil flowing, but it gives you a sense of what is at risk in that region in terms of Russian maritime traffic. There is also a bit of a thread discussing the role of Greek shipping from those ports and how Greece has slowly been selling its ships off to Russia to support that trade. But it could complicate matters if the Ukrainians continue to target oil-carrying ships, even if they're militarily relevant in that they may not all be Russian-flagged, and so there could ultimately be complications. It's likely, I have seen some people discuss the fact that it's likely the SIG was selected very specifically as a target, and so hopefully Ukraine continues to be thoughtful in its targeting if it continues this strategy. That leads into that last tweet in the post under the phrase escalation risk. And so that's an initial tweet that was released by The Lookout, where he essentially says what he makes what he says is an unpopular argument, saying that he hopes it's been well thought through by the Ukrainians because there is a risk of escalation that could lead to, a strategic situation that may create more risks for Ukraine than it does benefits. And if you were to have a look at the Lookout's profile, he made a much longer thread on this risk of escalation, attempting to draw on some points from the laws of essentially naval warfare to say that while nations can try to blockade or capture or intercept neutrally flagged ships that may be transiting to the waters of the enemy, that it cannot attack them except under narrow circumstances where they're engaged in activities that make them a military target. And so you may want to check out that thread by the Lookout. And I don't know, Exit, did you have any thoughts on that thread regarding the risk of escalation, maybe as a teaser for what you may get into in your space tomorrow?
I'm trying to think of how to diplomatically put this. I understand the points that the Lookout was making. I don't really agree with a fair number of them from the perspective of this is not an escalation by Ukraine, in my opinion. It's merely a response to ongoing escalations from Russia. And I think if you go back and read through some of the maritime law stuff that I have had opportunity to do in the last couple of days, it seems very clear that, as are all SBU operations, this was very well planned, very well thought out. There might even be some clues from the drone video, as to the fact that maybe they were ensuring that they were hitting the correct ship. You see it circle around the back of the ship, and it's possible that one of the reasons they did that was to ensure that that was actually the right ship name and the right IMO for that ship. Those are not things we can know for sure without somebody confirming that, but to say that this is an escalation by Ukraine, I think is a little bit of a stretch in my personal opinion. However, I would encourage you to follow that account, because I really respect a lot of the other things they do, and they're great.
Thanks for that endorsement of them. Piotr, go ahead. Am I the only one not hearing Piotr?
I can't either hear him.
No. Okay. Piotr, if you're there, I don't know if you're on mute or if you're having microphone problems, but we'll come back to you in a minute. If you have to cycle, we'll happily bring you back up. Okay. So for the next set of material, yeah, I wanted to add one or two notes about the progress of the ongoing Ukrainian offensive. As usual, there are terrific accounts that do very detailed work at mapping, tracking the minute changes on the front, which is because there are so many who do that great work. I don't see any point in recreating the wheel. So the first item in the nest is the tweet that I put together each session, including some of the best mapping efforts. And so we've included, as usual, maps from the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, Andrew Perpetua, DEFMON, Project Owl, Poulet Volant, Deep State, and GeoConfirmed. I've also included the daily weather update from our friend David Helms, because I think that's relevant as well. I'll remind you, as usual, that so some of these maps will include unit locations. Others, will have more or less detail because they may have different sources. I think it's important to look at a variety of perspectives, which is why I include so many. If you want a more detailed walkthrough, I'd encourage you to listen to the live streams on YouTube that Andrew Perpetua holds, where he will share his screen and walk through the changes in his map. He holds those conversations on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time and Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to be a little bit more available to our European friends. So you can check out Andrew Perpetua's YouTube account in order to find those presentations. And occasionally my co-host Exit will join him in those talks. But in terms of updates regarding the offensive, again, I'm not going to break them out individually. I'll simply speak to them. The second tweet in the nest contains the links. If you'd like an overview of the current situation, there was a good article that was written in the Financial Times by Jack Watling, who is a senior analyst at the Royal United Services Institute in the UK, who gives a bit of a breakdown of the themes of the offensive, particularly the Ukrainian effort to try to target Russian artillery in order to chip away at their artillery advantage. And it seems like the Ukrainians are having a lot of success in that. In terms of progress on the ground, it remains slow but steady. And so if you'd like updates, there are claims, for example, that Ukraine is making some additional progress at gaining a foothold in the Dnipro River Delta. We've talked several times about the bridgehead under and around the Antonovsky Bridge, just across from the city of Kherson. But now there are additional reports of progress in crossing the islands. And so the Institute for the Study of War here is noting that the Ukrainians are now increasing their shelling on the city of Oleshki, and that they appear to be making gradual progress toward the city. There are also reports of gradual progress, around the city of Klishivka, which is to the south of Bakhmut, as the Ukrainians press on the flanks of the city there. And suggestion that Ukraine may now be attacking the city of Urozhaine, which is just to the south east of the city of Staromayorsk on the Zaporizhia axis. Staromayorsk just having been captured about a week ago, so they're now using that as a launching point to make further gains in the area. So again, slow but steady. And then as a final point, the Deputy Minister of Defense, Hannah Maliar, who gives daily updates, came out and noted that Ukraine in some places along the southern front line has broken through the first line of Russian defenses and moved on to the next, which she described as the intermediate one. And so, again, I would direct you to some of the maps I brought together if you want more specific details on progress there. The last point I wanted to speak about, a couple of hands are up. I'm going to go to Exit as co-host, and then we'll check if Piotr's back with us. Go ahead, Exit.
Just a quick note to say, Konstantin, if you ever run a space to teach us how to say all of these names, I will be first in line for that, because my good gravy.
I have 4 months of Duolingo training in Ukrainian, so I'm sure that my pronunciation is close to perfect by now. Piotr, are you back with us?
Even the way you say that, Michael, shows you how many times it happened too often. I hope I am. I don't think there's been a space where I've attended and there hasn't been an electrical or whatever, connectivity issue. No, I just wanted to sign off and say thank you very much for the space, and to tie a little bit of what we touched upon with Nigel to the grain matter. Exit, amazing job as always. Really appreciate your posts, reading them daily. The Russian Africa Summit last week, right? Really interesting, just because, again, people on one side of this narrative really pushing it as though, the West is done, or it's not even about a Western sort of thing. It's more, I think we should prioritize trying to look at it from a African perspective first, and sort of, instead of what Russia gets out of Africa or West gets out of Africa kind of narrative first. But, in reality, only 17 countries actually attended it, next to 43. And part of the reason for this is that a lot of countries were pissed with the fact that the Russians withdrew from the grain deal. And I think it's really interesting that Putin was really, really keen to try and establish bilateral agreements with several different African nations to deliver grain directly, and not many of them, I think, took him up on that, or there wasn't much development on that. So, as we continue to see more developments over the grain situation, over the general sort of Black Sea stability and security. I was reading one article from the Council on Foreign Relations, I think end of last week, about, should we begin providing escorts to these shipments? If so, who does that? What's the propensity for there to be attacks on them? And all these sorts of questions are running around the heads of people at the moment. So, I just wanted to tie the two African and Ukraine-Russia thing together, because that's sort of mainly what I've been talking about in the space. But thank you very much, and look forward to seeing your spaces in the next few days.
Yeah, thanks, Piotr. As always, happy to have you join us. Exit, go ahead.
Just to follow up that point, we did actually see a joint statement come out from Putin and the African leaders. I think it was yesterday, maybe the day before, noting specifically that grain shipments should continue, but also that they wanted the 200,000 tons of fertilizer held in EU countries sent to African countries, which, if you haven't been following along as closely as I have, you will find ironic, because it was Russia that for a long time said no to releasing those fertilizer supplies to African countries. So that was an interesting thing. But also kind of similarly on something that I think we maybe haven't heard as much about. I know I haven't seen as much coverage about it. The meetings in Saudi Arabia yesterday about peace negotiations or talks, we just haven't seen a lot of coverage of that. And it's interesting to me that those types of things aren't getting as much coverage as maybe you would hope.
Piotr, welcome back. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just exit making me following the Saudi Arabian negotiations quite closely. Maybe if I do get my act together enough, maybe have space on that later in the week. But again, really want to emphasize, because exit sort of did that already, but for anyone listening in Michael's space, if you go into other spaces with people who have no idea what they're talking about, or if they have an apolitical agenda, just keep in mind, if people are vehemently against Western activities for whatever reason, we need to, whataboutism and the double standards of the West, etc., etc. But equally, keep in mind that Putin and Russia are not interested in Africa for altruism. They're interested in it for their own self-interest. So the replacement of Russia in the west of Africa or Niger because of the French leaving is not because Russia's doing it to sort of free the Africans of the Western colonial states, and the fact that Russia held the summit and the whole desire of replacing or also renegotiating the grain deals. It's not for liberalistic, idealistic purposes. It is all because Russia has its own interests, and anyone who tries to convince you otherwise is playing a political set of mind games. And because that's one of the biggest narratives I've seen on this platform from accounts like Sprinter and other bollocks, I just want to underline that, because it's, well, I'm not defending Western interests, but I think this sort of ridiculous sort of treatment that Russia's somehow some savior against other countries is absurd, given what's happening in Ukraine and what was that the statue with the change of the symbol on the shield, right? That's what we're really dealing with. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Piotr. So we're jumping back and forth a little bit, but just to wrap up with the last point on developments in Ukraine, that happened just earlier today were some strikes on some logistically significant bridges. So if you have a look at the, I believe it's the third item back in the nest, that there's a map here that shows you which bridges were hit. And so the bridges were the Chonhar and the I believe it's the Heneshensk bridges. So the Chonhar bridge was struck, I want to say about a month ago. And apparently after that strike, the Russians almost immediately built a pontoon bridge underneath it. but it was suggested that it wouldn't carry nearly the same capacity of traffic, and that heavier trucks would have to likely bypass. However, there is also a nearby rail bridge in the same vicinity as the Chonhar Bridge that remained active after the initial strike. About a week ago, I think it was a week ago, the Russians then struck that nearby rail bridge. So now bridges 1 and 2 have both been struck. That was as of about a week ago. Just this morning, there was a second strike on the Chonhar Bridge, the road bridge. And then there was a strike at the Henichens Bridge, which you'll see on this map in the tweet by Visegrad, is in the lower left portion. So that means that now even a detour will have to go a much further distance around. And as you scroll through the items in the nest, the third item back, tweet by Knoll Reports, the local governor, the Russian appointed governor of the occupied territories, released a picture showing the damage to the Chonhar Bridge, which is significant, but it still looks like it might be partly passable, even if it may not permit heavier equipment to transit it. The fourth item back in the nest shows the damage to the Henichens Bridge, which is more considerable. You see that the road has actually been buckled, and apparently there was a gas pipeline that transited along the side of the bridge that was broken and caused a fire as well. And so these are significant logistical strikes against the Russians, which, taken together with the strikes against the landing ships in the Black Sea, which could potentially be used as ferries, and the continued worry. So when the SIG tanker was hit, there was a lot of fear that among the Russians that it was another attempt on the Kerch Bridge, which at this point has been struck twice. And so, these strikes against logistics are definitely accumulating, and I'm sure, I think we'll have to inevitably contribute to undermining the logistics supply to the front in Zaporizhia. The fifth item back in the nest, fifth item back. Sorry, there it goes. Is interesting because it actually shows that there was a miss by the Ukrainians. I think the assumption is that the strikes on these bridges are being carried out by Storm Shadow missiles from the UK, which the Ukrainians are only able to carry on their Su-24 aircraft. And they tend to punch holes in the deck in a way similar to the damage that we're seeing. But it's interesting that apparently one missed, and you can see the smoke and apparent impact mark both the successful strike on the bridge and the miss in the fifth item back in the nest, the tweet by Intel Crab, which just also reminds me that in the large-scale missile attack that Russia launched against Ukraine yesterday evening, in which they fired, I think it was something like 30 cruise missiles and another 25 or so drones. A significant number of those missiles were fired at Ukrainian Air Force Base, believed to house some of their Su-24 fighters that carry the Storm Shadow missiles. But the Ukrainian Air Force spokesman, I think his name is Yuri Ignat, came out and said that Ukraine has procedures in order to protect aircraft, and that there was enough notice that they managed to either protect them in place or to scramble some of them. So the Ukrainians aren't speaking to whether or not they took any damage, but he is saying that they scrambled and managed to protect the aircraft for the most part. Whether those same aircraft targeted at that field were involved in the strikes on these two bridges is unknown, but essentially it's like a reversal, right? The Russians are under so much pressure from the use of the Storm Shadow missiles that they have repeatedly targeted them, but their latest attack was not significant enough to end the threat, as demonstrated by the almost immediate use of them to destroy these bridges. And the last point I'll leave you on the bridge front is a bit of a joke. It's the sixth item back in the nest from Artois. And it's a comparison of the targeting effectiveness of the Ukrainians and the Russians. And so these are aerial photographs showing the Chonhar Bridge with the strike squarely in the middle.
Go ahead.
With the strike squarely in the middle. And then the Ukrainian airfield, where it appears that the Russians missed almost all of their strikes. And he, of course, the joke is he's labeled it as woke and broke. Exit, go ahead.
Just on the airfield, it was Ukrainian Air Force Day, and we also saw this morning what is believed to be today's image of Zelensky visiting that airfield, and some Patriot missile batteries in the background, as well as him signing some of the missiles on planes. Definitely a giant finger in the air to Russia, essentially.
Yeah, just putting one final thing in the nest, inspired by your comment there. Zelensky was signing Scalp missiles provided by France. If I'm not mistaken, that may have been the first instance in which the Scalp was provided, or where the Scalp has been photographed in Ukraine. And interestingly, for the photo op, they put a Scalp on one side of the aircraft and a Storm Shadow on the other. And I've added to the nest, I think rather, pleasantly symbolically, the Ukrainian trident. What is it? The Trizub, I think, is the name for the symbol. On the Storm Shadow, the center spire has been replaced with Big Ben for the UK, and on the Scalp missile, the center spire of the Trident was replaced by a graphic of the Eiffel Tower, which I thought was a nice touch. Ukraine does a great job at its marketing. So I think that's where we'll wrap up. We're about a half an hour past time. But I'll say thank you to everybody who joined us today. I think we had some great conversation. We had Stephen join us to chat about some of his analysis of Russian propaganda techniques that he has come across in his work contributing to War Translated. And we had our friend Fabian join us from Germany to chat about some of the work that he's doing looking at Niger. And we had a long conversation about that with several of our friends who are experts. And I appreciate all their contributions. So thank you to all of our speakers today. I'd encourage you to check their profiles out. In general, they've been following the war the entire time, and working very hard at keeping people up to date. Consider giving them a follow. And I'd like to thank my co-hosts, Jacoby and Exit. Without your guys' help, it would be extremely difficult to host these spaces. Our next conversation will be this coming Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I've put an invitation to it in the nest if you want to take the last opportunity to set your reminders for it. And hopefully I'll see you then. Other than that, guys, have a great night.